Hello, my friend. Welcome to Sleepy Old World. Get comfortable. Because tonight we step inside a great English country house in the last years before the First World War, into the private world of the people who made a place like Highclere Castle look as though it simply ran on its own. A housemaid could slip in and out of a bedroom while its owner slept only a few feet away, and never once wake her, never once leave a single trace behind. This same house would one day become known to millions of people around the world as Downton Abbey, though tonight we're not stepping into that story at all. We are stepping into the real one, the one that actually happened inside these walls. And at a formal dinner in this house, there could be so many different utensils laid beside your plate that you could easily lose track of which one you were supposed to use next. If a story like this one has ever helped carry you towards sleep, a like and a subscribe helps this small channel find its way to someone else who might need it tonight too. It costs you nothing, and it means more to me than you would probably guess. I would honestly love to know where you're settling in from tonight. Leave it in the comments. I always read every single one. All right, love, let's begin. It is not the great hall you should picture first, not the golden towers catching the very first grey light of a Hampshire morning, not the long gravel drive and its rows of cedar trees standing like sentries. That is the postcard version, the one from the television series that made this house's name familiar to people who had never heard of Hampshire in their lives. The real morning at Highclere begins somewhere else entirely, in a room upstairs where a woman has not yet opened her eyes, and where an enormous, careful effort has already gone into making sure that when she does, none of that effort will show at all. From the lawn outside at this hour, the whole house still looks completely asleep. Every curtain drawn, every window dark. But 2 floors below the bedrooms, a fire has already been built up in the kitchen range, and somewhere along a corridor no guest will ever think to walk down. A young housemaid is already moving quietly from door to door, and not one detail of any of it will ever be visible from the room where this particular woman is about to wake. We will come back down to that hidden half of the house properly later tonight, once we have spent some time upstairs first. Maybe she's 32 years old, this woman, and maybe she's not the mistress of the house at all, but a guest, a friend of the family staying for a week that will stretch, as these visits often did, into something closer to 10 days, once everyone involved decided they were enjoying themselves too much to end it on schedule. Maybe her name does not particularly matter for our purposes tonight, so let us simply call her by the kind of name that suited a woman of her position in 1911 and say she is Mrs. Aldworth, and that she arrived at Highclere 2 days ago by train, with a lady's maid, 4 trunks, a hat box, and a dressing case that alone probably weighed more than most people's entire luggage today. She wakes, this particular morning, a little after 7, in a room on the first floor with a window facing east, so that the earliest light of the day has already been finding its way past the edges of the heavy curtains for perhaps 20 minutes before she actually opens her eyes. The fire her housemaid built an hour and a half earlier has settled into a steady warm glow, taking the edge off a room that would otherwise be genuinely cold this early in an English June. Castles being, whatever else they are, extremely good at holding on to cold stone through a summer morning. She lies still for a moment, the way most people do on waking in an unfamiliar bed, letting the room resolve itself around her, the pale wallpaper, the heavy dark furniture, a washstand with a jug and basin she has already grown used to over 2 mornings, a small clock ticking on the mantel that she can hear now that she is properly awake, marking time in a way that feels, at 7 in the morning in a house like this, entirely unhurried. There is a small photograph in a folding travel frame on the nightstand. Her husband in a stiff formal pose taken 2 winters ago. A book lies face down on the chair by the window, spine slightly cracked, exactly where she left it 2 nights ago. None of these things belong to the room itself. They are hers, carried here in the dressing case, small anchors of an ordinary life set down carefully inside a house built for a much grander one. She has not unpacked much else beyond these, leaving most of her wardrobe folded in the trunk Sarah manages, but these particular few objects she likes having near her wherever she happens to be staying. A woman travels lighter than her 4 trunks might suggest, when you consider how little of what actually makes a room feel like her own has anything to do with the size of her luggage at all. Beyond the heavy curtains, not yet fully open, a narrow strip of grey morning light falls across the carpet, and through the gap she can just make out a slice of lawn running down toward the cedar trees, still silvered with dew, a single bird crossing low over the grass. Somewhere further off, past the edge of the lawn, a low mist still clings to the parkland, the kind that will burn away entirely within the hour, though right now it gives the whole view a soft, unfinished quality, like a room not quite ready to be looked at yet. Mrs. Aldworth watches it for a moment longer than she needs to, the way people sometimes do with a view they know they will only have for a limited number of mornings, and then let Sarah draw the curtains the rest of the way. It is a view she has woken to twice now, and has already, in that quiet human way, begun to think of as her own, though nothing about this room, down to the water in the jug and the fire in the grate, arrived here by anything other than someone else's careful planning. That fire did not simply happen on its own. An hour and a half earlier, in the last grey dark before dawn, a young housemaid had knelt at this very grate with a wooden box of blacklead and matches, building it log by log while Mrs. Aldworth slept undisturbed only a few feet away, and had slipped back out again so quietly that nothing in the room now gives away that anyone was ever in it at all. Mrs. Aldworth does not think about this morning or any other, and there is no particular cruelty in that. It simply never occurs to her to wonder, any more than it occurs to most people to wonder who grew the wheat in their morning toast. The fire is warm. That is the whole of what she needs to know about it. There is no need to ring yet. She knows, from 2 mornings of experience, that her own maid will appear within minutes of any sound suggesting she's awake. Footsteps in the corridor, the creak of the bed, and sure enough, there is a soft knock, and the door opens just enough for a face to appear, checking before entering fully. Sarah has been standing just outside for perhaps 3 minutes already, close enough to hear the bed creak, but far enough to give the room a proper knock, rather than simply walking in, a small courtesy that costs her nothing, and that Mrs. Aldworth would likely never think to notice was being extended to her at all. Her maid's name, for our purposes, is Sarah, and Sarah has been with Mrs. Aldworth for 6 years, long enough to know without asking that the first thing wanted is the curtains open the rest of the way, and the second thing wanted is tea, brought up on a small tray before anything else happens at all, because Mrs. Aldworth does not believe in facing a washstand or a corset, or a decision about which dress suits the day, before she's had at least half a cup of tea in her. The tea arrives on a small tray with its own tiny pot, a single cup, a thin slice of bread and butter that nobody particularly expects her to eat, but that habit dictates should be there regardless. The bread is always cut thin, always slightly cool by the time it reaches her, and Mrs. Aldworth has never once in 2 mornings actually eaten a bite of it, though she would probably notice in some vague, unarticulated way if it stopped appearing on the tray. She drinks it sitting up in bed, the pillows arranged behind her, while Sarah moves quietly around the room laying out the morning's first outfit. Not the dress she will wear at breakfast necessarily, but the simpler wrapper and underthings needed for washing, and the early stages of dressing before the real decision about the day's clothing gets made properly. A woman like Mrs. Aldworth, staying at a house like this one for a week, will change her clothing completely, top to bottom, undergarments included, somewhere between 4 and 6 times over the course of a single day. Not adjustments, not a shawl added or removed. Full changes, entire different outfits suited to entirely different activities. There is the early morning wrapper. There is the outfit for breakfast, less formal than what comes later, but still entirely put together, because appearing at breakfast in anything resembling undress would have been unthinkable. There is a walking or outdoor dress if the morning includes any activity outside, sturdier fabric, a shorter skirt clearing the ground by a practical few inches. There is, quite often, a change before luncheon into something a little lighter and more social. There is the afternoon dress, worn for tea and calls and whatever quiet indoor activity fills the hours before evening. And there is, longest and most elaborate of all, the evening dress, put on with an entirely separate hour and a half of preparation that we'll get to properly much later tonight, once the sun has gone down on this very long day we are spending together. Sarah has already noted, without needing to say so aloud, that the room has warmed nicely, and moves on to the next task with the particular, unhurried efficiency of someone who has done this exact sequence hundreds of times before. This morning, though, comes first the washstand, and the can of hot water sitting ready beside it did not simply appear there either. It had been carried up 4 flights of narrow back stairs only minutes earlier by a young footman, one of dozens of such trips he will make before this day is through. Moving quickly and invisibly along a staircase Mrs. Aldworth has never once had reason to use herself. That particular footman is barely more than a boy, 15 years old, known below stairs as Tom, and though Mrs. Aldworth has passed him a dozen times this week on the back stairs without once registering his face, he could probably tell you, without needing to think about it, exactly how she likes her water. He sets the can down outside her door, straightens for a moment to catch his breath, and is already moving on to the next one before the sound of his footsteps has properly faded. Sarah pours it now into the large porcelain basin that sits on the washstand beside the smaller jug of cold. Mrs. Aldworth washes, as most women of her class and era did, in stages rather than a single full bath, because the full bath is a twice-weekly event requiring the copper tub down the corridor and an entirely separate production of hot water, carried up in far larger quantities. This morning is the ordinary wash: face, neck, arms, hands, a soft flannel cloth worked over with a mild soap, then a cool rinse that Sarah insists is good for the skin regardless of what any doctor might say about it. There is something almost meditative in watching a routine like this unfold. The same motions repeated morning after morning for years, each stage flowing into the next without either woman needing to speak much at all. An entire private choreography built from 6 years of practice. Then comes the hair, and if you have never sat and thought about what 1911 actually required of a woman's hair before breakfast, it is worth pausing here, briefly, because it will change how you picture every photograph you have ever seen of women from this era. Mrs. Aldworth's hair, unbound now from its overnight braid, falls well past her shoulders, thick and a deep brown that catches faint red in direct light. Sarah brushes it through first, long even strokes from root to end. 100 strokes is the old rule. Though nobody actually counts anymore by 1911, it has simply become the physical rhythm both women expect. Brush moving, hair falling. The small quiet sound of bristles against strands filling the room, the way conversation might in a different kind of relationship. The style itself, once the brushing is done, takes the better part of 30 minutes to build properly. Hair swept up and back, pinned into a soft full shape at the crown, a few pieces arranged loosely at the front and sides to soften the line of the face. The whole structure held together by perhaps 20 small pins that Sarah places with a speed that comes from having done this exact motion, on this exact head of hair several thousand times before. It is not a hairstyle so much as a small piece of architecture, built fresh every single morning and taken down again every single night. An enormous, unremarked labour that both women simply understand as part of what a day is. Sarah checks the finished shape from 2 angles, in the small hand mirror before she's satisfied, tucking one last loose strand behind Mrs. Aldworth's ear with the kind of casual precision that only comes from years of doing the exact same small motion on the exact same head, morning after morning. Underneath all of this, before the outer dress goes on at all, come the layers that made up the actual foundation of an Edwardian woman's silhouette, and this is where the corset enters the story, and I want to be honest with you about it rather than dramatic, because the corset of 1911 had already changed quite a bit from the tightly cinched Victorian version most people picture. The fashionable shape of this particular moment, sometimes called the S-bend or health corset in its earlier form, had by 1911 softened into something straighter through the front, less about the extreme small waist of decades earlier, and more about a smooth, long, upright line. It still laced up the back, still required another person's hands to do properly, still shaped the body into the fashionable silhouette of the year in a way no woman could achieve entirely on her own. Sarah laces it not violently tight, the old myth of women fainting from restriction being considerably overstated for most ordinary daily wear, but firmly, evenly, checking as she goes that Mrs. Aldworth can still breathe comfortably and bend at the waist without real difficulty. It takes practice to lace a corset well. Too loose, and the whole structure of the dress above it will not sit correctly. Too tight, and the wearer will be uncomfortable within the hour and unable to hide it, which in a house full of watching eyes is its own small social failure. Sarah has laced enough corsets over enough years to judge it almost entirely by feel now. A small tug here, a slight easing there, checking Mrs. Aldworth's breathing rather than any measurement, and finishing with a question asked quietly. Is that comfortable? That she has asked in exactly this way every single morning for 6 years. Over the corset comes a fine linen chemise already worn beneath it, then stockings, silk for daytime wear on a woman of Mrs. Aldworth's means, rolled up and secured above the knee, then a petticoat or two depending on the weight the day's dress requires beneath it. And only now, after perhaps 40 minutes of quiet, patient, entirely private labour that not a single other person in the house will ever witness or think about, does the actual dress go on. This morning it is a soft grey walking dress, chosen the night before after some discussion with Sarah about the likely weather, pressed the evening before by hands Mrs. Aldworth will never think to thank, and fastened up the back with a long row of small hooks that Sarah's fingers move down with a kind of speed that looks from a distance almost like a magic trick. Mrs. Aldworth checks her reflection once the last hook is closed, turning slightly at the waist to see the line of the skirt in the wardrobe mirror, and gives a small satisfied nod that requires no words at all, a signal Sarah has learned to read as clearly as any sentence. It is the closest thing to a compliment either of them will exchange this morning, and it is in its own quiet way entirely enough for both of them. Jewellery this early in the day is modest by the standards this same woman will observe again tonight. A small brooch, a thin gold chain, nothing that competes with what evening will eventually demand. Gloves are laid ready by the door, though she will not put them on until she actually leaves the room, because gloves indoors, except at the most formal occasions, were considered slightly odd, a small rule among hundreds of small rules that governed a woman's day, and that she has simply absorbed so completely by now that she never has to think about any of them at all. By the time Sarah steps back to survey the finished result, brooch pinned, chain fastened, every hook and pin exactly where it should be, the whole transformation has taken the better part of an hour, though neither woman would describe it as an hour spent on anything so simple as getting dressed. It was closer to a small daily construction project, precise and unhurried, that happened to end with a woman standing in the middle of the room looking, to anyone who did not know better, as though she had simply thrown on a dress and walked out the door. 8:20 finds Mrs. Aldworth fully dressed. Her hair is done. Her room smells faintly of the rosewater in her cold cream and the coal smoke of the fire still settling in the grate, and she steps out into the corridor to find it exactly as warm and exactly as quiet as it was the morning before, as though the whole house existed permanently in this single state of gentle readiness, waiting for her specifically to appear. She pulls the door closed behind her without a backward glance, already thinking about breakfast, and the room she leaves behind will not stay empty for long, though she has no reason to imagine that either. Downstairs, while all of this was unfolding above, a dozen smaller versions of the same quiet effort were happening at once, none of it visible from where Mrs. Aldworth now sits, and none of it likely to be at any point today. That, more than anything, is the whole point of a house like this one. A valet in a room off the servants' hall brushed the dust from a gentleman's coat and set a pair of newly polished riding boots by the door, buffed to the particular dull gleam that this house considered correct, neither too dull nor too showy. A groom had already ridden down to the village and back with the morning's letters and newspapers, ironed flat by a footman's hand to keep the ink from smudging onto anyone's gloves, and laid out precisely by each place at the breakfast table before a single guest had come down to claim a seat. None of it announced itself. It simply arrived the way weather arrives, as though the house itself had decided this was how the morning ought to look. Nobody sitting down to breakfast this morning would ever think to trace any of it back to a single specific pair of hands, and that, more than anything else, is the whole point of how a house like this one is meant to work. Let us leave her for a moment on the stairs and go back down to the kitchen passage, because something small has happened this morning that is going to matter later, and I want to mention it now while it is fresh, the way it would have reached the housekeeper fresh, by telegram, delivered up from the village post office by the same groom who brought the newspapers. Nothing about her walk down the stairs shows any of this yet. That comes next. Mrs. Ferris had already finished her own morning inspection by the time the telegram reached her, moving room by room through the ground floor with the same bunch of keys at her belt that she carries everywhere, checking that the fires laid before dawn had caught properly, that the flowers cut for the hall table had been arranged the way she prefers them, that nothing anywhere in the public rooms looked even slightly less than it should. She had paused briefly in the library to straighten a single cushion that had been left slightly askew, a detail so small that no guest would ever have noticed it, and yet the kind of detail that, left uncorrected, would have bothered her for the rest of the morning. It is a walk she has made every single morning for 12 years, and she could probably complete it with her eyes closed, though she has never once in all that time actually needed to. It arrived folded into a small yellow envelope, carried up from the village post office on foot rather than by the groom this time, since the boy who usually rides down for the morning papers had already left before the telegram office opened. It is barely 8:30 when it reaches Mrs. Ferris, which means the whole rest of the morning she had already carefully mapped out in her head, fires and flowers and linen in their proper sequence, has just quietly rearranged itself in the space of about 4 seconds. She does not sigh, does not close her eyes for even a moment, does not do any of the small human things a person might reasonably do when a morning suddenly changes shape without warning. Whoever delivered it set it directly into the housekeeper's hands rather than leaving it on the hall table with the ordinary post, the unspoken signal that told her, before she had even opened it, that this one mattered more than most. The telegram is for the 6th Earl, or for whichever version of the family we are imagining running the house this particular June, and it concerns a guest, a Lady Beauchamp, let us say, who was expected to arrive on the 4 o'clock train that afternoon along with her own maid and the usual complement of trunks. The telegram, however, says something different. It says she has changed her plans, that she will in fact be arriving on the morning train instead, which reaches the local station shortly after 11, which means the house now has considerably less time than it thought it had to prepare a bedroom that was, as of 6 o'clock this morning, not remotely ready for anyone at all. She reads it twice before reacting at all, standing perfectly still in the small room off the servants' hall where such messages are received, the morning light coming thin and grey through a single high window. She reads it a third time, mostly to be certain, and only then folds it once, neatly, along its original crease. She slips it into her apron pocket rather than leaving it on the small table, out of a habit so old she could not tell you when it started. Reading this telegram standing in the little room off the servants' hall where such things are received, and her face, if anyone had been watching, would have shown almost nothing at all, which is itself a kind of skill worth noticing. She does not panic. She does not sigh dramatically or announce the change to the room. She simply turns, finds the head housemaid and says, in a voice pitched for exactly the two of them, that the blue room will be needed by 10:30 rather than by 4, and that the change of plan should not, under any circumstances, become visible to anyone above stairs. This is the quiet art of a well-run house. Problems exist. Problems are solved. Nobody upstairs is ever meant to know a problem existed at all. Within minutes, word has already reached the head housemaid, who does not question the change or ask why, only asks how much time they actually have, and begins in her own head working backward from 10:30 the same way Mrs. Nettlefold works backward from a dinner hour, counting the fires, the linen, the flowers, the water, everything that now needs to happen roughly 5 hours sooner than anyone had planned for it. She is already moving toward the blue room before Mrs. Ferris has finished giving the instruction, mentally listing which two housemaids can be pulled off their current tasks without anyone upstairs noticing they were ever occupied with anything else. There is no discussion of whether this is possible, it simply has to be, and so it will be. She has never once in her time at Highclere been asked to do something impossible, difficult often, impossible never. We will come back to this later in the morning and see exactly how a bedroom that was, an hour ago, simply an empty room with dust sheets over the furniture becomes ready to receive a guest with less than 5 hours' notice. For now, though, let us follow Mrs. Aldworth down to breakfast, because there is a whole different world waiting for her at the bottom of those stairs. Mrs. Aldworth, of course, knows nothing about any of this yet, and will not know for hours if she ever properly registers it at all. She is already halfway down the grand staircase by the time the telegram is being read 2 floors below her, her hand light on the polished banister, thinking about nothing more urgent than whether there will be kedgeree again this morning, which tells you almost everything you need to know about how well this particular kind of house did its job. 2 entirely different mornings are unfolding at the exact same moment inside the exact same house, and only one of them will ever leave a trace anyone remembers. Both of them are real, only one of them was ever meant to be seen. The dining room itself, at this early hour, is filled with a particular kind of morning light that never quite repeats itself the same way twice. Sun coming in low through tall windows facing east, catching the silver on the sideboard and throwing small moving reflections across the ceiling whenever someone lifts a covered dish. It smells of coffee and toast and something faintly of the beeswax polish used on the long table the evening before, warm and ordinary and entirely unremarkable to anyone who has breakfasted in this room more than a handful of times. A window stands slightly open at one end, just enough to let in a thread of cool morning air and the faint sound of a gardener somewhere out on the lawn, the soft rhythmic snip of shears working along a hedge that will still be there trimmed and tidy long after everyone currently at this table has gone home. The dining room at breakfast has a different character entirely from what it will have tonight. There is no fixed seating, no careful arrangement of who sits beside whom. None of the choreography that dinner will require later. People simply arrive, at whatever hour suits them, help themselves from the dishes kept warm on the long sideboard along one wall. Silver covers lifted and set back down by whichever footman happens to be stationed in the room, and sit wherever there happens to be a free chair and a congenial face nearby. Mrs. Aldworth finds 2 other guests already at the table, a married couple down from Yorkshire whose names I will not bother inventing for you, deep in a conversation about a horse one of them apparently wants to buy, and she settles into the empty chair beside them with the easy familiarity of someone 2 days into a visit rather than someone arriving fresh, unfolding her napkin with the small unthinking motion of a person already entirely at home in a room that was, until 2 days ago, a stranger to her. A footman appears at her elbow almost before she has finished sitting down, and this is worth noticing because it is not luck, it is training. The footmen serving breakfast have learnt to watch the room the way a good waiter watches a restaurant without appearing to watch it at all, catching the moment someone sits down and moving toward them before any request has been made. "Tea or coffee?" he asks. "Tea," she says, and it appears within a minute, along with her choice from the sideboard, eggs and a small portion of the kedgeree she has developed something of a fondness for since arriving. She could not tell you this footman's name if you asked her, though he has served her breakfast every single morning since she arrived, has already learned, without ever being told directly, that she takes her tea without milk and prefers the kedgeree served slightly apart from the eggs rather than touching them. This is its own particular kind of skill, remembering the small private preferences of a dozen different guests at once, none of whom would think to thank him for it, and all of whom would notice, immediately and unpleasantly, if he ever got one of them wrong. Behind the sideboard's easy abundance stands a cook who began building toward this exact half hour before 5 that same morning. A woman in her late 40s named, let us say, Mrs. Nettlefold, holding the whole of the day's meals in her head the way a conductor holds a score, though nobody reaching for the toast rack this morning has any particular reason to think about her at all. She has already, in the last 20 minutes, sent word up through a footman that the kedgeree is ready and the eggs are being done fresh in small batches so nothing sits too long under its silver cover. She will not sit down herself, not properly, until well past 9, once the last plate has gone up and the kitchen has settled into the brief lull before luncheon planning begins all over again. Her post has been brought in and set beside her place, 3 letters, one clearly from her sister judging by the handwriting, and a morning paper, ironed flat and folded to the front page exactly as it was for every other place at the table, a small odd custom of the era meant to set the ink and keep it from smudging onto gloves. The letter from her sister, when she opens it, turns out to be mostly news of a nephew's christening and a complaint about the summer heat in Norfolk, ordinary domestic news that has nothing at all to do with castles or corsets. And reading it here, at this particular table, gives the whole morning a small grounding pull back toward the rest of her actual life, the one waiting for her at the end of this visit. She reads while she eats, which nobody considers rude, glancing up occasionally to rejoin the horse conversation when it drifts somewhere she has an opinion on. And this is really the whole texture of breakfast in a house like this, unhurried, informal within a very formal structure. A meal that looks on the surface like the easiest thing in the world, requiring nothing more than sitting down and being served, and that is in fact the product of a kitchen that began preparing it before 5 in the morning and a service staff trained for years to make its own labour invisible. A meal that has never once in 2 mornings gone wrong in any way she would notice. Somewhere down the table the Yorkshire couple are still discussing the horse, the price apparently having gone up twice already since the conversation began, and Mrs. Aldworth glances up just long enough to offer an opinion before returning to her letter. It might help to understand this whole machine properly if we step back for a moment and look at how it is actually organised, because a house like this one in 1911 runs on a hierarchy nearly as formal in its own way as the family upstairs, and knowing the shape of it makes everything else about the day easier to follow. At the top of the indoor staff sits the butler, a man in his 50s in most houses of this standing, responsible above all for the dining room, the wine cellar, the plate, meaning the silver, and the male servants below him, principally the footman. He does not, as a rule, do physical labour himself except at the most ceremonial moments, carving perhaps, or serving wine at dinner with his own hands because that particular task was considered too important to delegate. His real work is oversight, judgment, the accumulated knowledge of exactly how things are done in this particular house, which is not necessarily how they are done in any other house, and which took him years in service to learn properly. Beside him in authority, and answering to nobody but the family itself, sits the housekeeper, a woman who runs the female side of the household with an authority that would have astonished anyone who thought Edwardian women held no real power. She controls the housemaids, the still room where preserves and household remedies are made, the linen cupboards, which in a house this size are practically a small warehouse, and a set of household accounts that she balances with the seriousness of a person running a genuine business, because in a real sense she is. Below these two sit the specialists. The cook, commanding her own kitchen staff with an authority the housekeeper does not overrule, because the kitchen is its own kingdom with its own particular etiquette about who may enter it. The valet, attached personally to the head of the house, or a male guest of particular standing, responsible for that one man's clothing and grooming with an intimacy that made a good valet nearly a confidant. The lady's maid, like Sarah, in the same relationship to whichever woman she serves. Footmen who carry, serve, answer doors, and lend the whole household a visual polish, chosen in some houses partly for their height and appearance, which sounds strange to say aloud but was an openly acknowledged consideration at the time. Housemaids who do the endless physical work of fires and cleaning and bedrooms. Kitchen maids and scullery maids below the cook. Grooms and stable hands out at the stables, a separate small kingdom of their own. Gardeners tending grounds that required in a house of this size a permanent staff of their own working essentially year-round. 25, 30, sometimes more people, each with a defined place in a structure so precise that a footman would no more think of correcting a housemaid than a housemaid would think of giving orders to the butler. And the whole structure has its own physical geography built specifically to keep it invisible. Behind the walls that hold the grand staircase and the family bedrooms runs an entirely separate set of corridors and stairs, narrower, plainer, lit by smaller windows or none at all, connecting the kitchens in the basement to the bedrooms on the upper floors without a single crossing point where a footman carrying coal might accidentally meet a lady on her way to breakfast. Doors along the main corridors, doors that look, if you did not know better, like they might lead to a cupboard or a small closet, actually open onto this second house folded invisibly inside the first one. A guest could stay at Highclere for a week and never once see the door that a housemaid used 40 times a day, 20 feet from where that same guest slept. There is a bell system too, a whole wall of small brass bells in the servants' hall, each one connected by a network of wires to a pull cord in a specific room upstairs, each one labelled so that when a bell rings, the servant on duty knows instantly which room requires attention without needing to guess. This system, mechanical and slightly clattering compared to what would come later, was in the process of being partly replaced by electric bells in houses like this one by 1911, part of the broader wave of new technology arriving quietly alongside centuries-old tradition, something we will come back to later tonight. For now it is enough to say that somewhere below stairs a housemaid is finishing her tea when a specific bell rings and she is on her feet and moving before the sound has properly stopped. It took years to build a staff capable of running like this without visible strain. Most of the people filling these roles had started young, at 14 or 15, in the very lowest positions. A scullery maid scrubbing pots, a hall boy blacking grates, and had climbed slowly through the ranks by proving themselves reliable in the smallest, least glamorous tasks first. A housemaid who wanted to become a lady's maid one day needed to show, over months and years, that she could be trusted with delicate fabrics, with a mistress's temper on a bad morning, with secrets she would never repeat below stairs. A footman who wanted to become a butler eventually needed to demonstrate again and again the particular calm that let him carry a tray of full wine glasses across a crowded room without a single one trembling. None of this training was written down in any formal sense. It was passed on the way most skilled trades were passed on in this era, by watching, by correcting, by being quietly told once, and being expected never to need telling twice. Let us go find the housekeeper now, because the blue room, still under its dust sheets and its faint smell of a room too long unused, and the guest arriving 5 hours earlier than expected, need attending to. She has already assigned 2 housemaids to the task, and they are moving through the blue room with the particular efficiency of people who understand exactly how much time they do not have. Dust sheets are pulled from the furniture and folded away. Windows are opened briefly to air the room, closed again once the fresh air has done its work, because a stuffy, unused room has a particular smell that no guest should ever be allowed to notice. The bed is stripped down to its frame and remade completely, fresh linen from the housekeeper's own store, sheets so crisp they practically hold their shape on their own, blankets aired and smoothed, the whole bed built up in careful layers the way a bed in a house like this always is. Not simply thrown together but constructed, with a precision that would satisfy an engineer. A fire is laid in the grate, ready to be lit closer to the guest's actual arrival so the room will be properly warm without wasting coal on a fire burning for hours before anyone benefits from it. Fresh flowers are cut from the garden and arranged in a small vase on the dressing table, something the head gardener was asked for at short notice and produced within the hour because a house like this treats its own garden as an extension of its household staff in every meaningful sense. Towels, fresh and neatly folded, are set beside the washstand. The water jug is filled and left ready to be topped with hot water the moment word comes that the guest's train has actually arrived, because nobody wants water going lukewarm in a jug an hour before it is needed. Downstairs, word has already gone to the stables that a carriage, or perhaps the motor car if the family currently keeps one and prefers it for station runs, needs to be at the station by 11 to meet the earlier train. A full adjustment to what had been planned for 4 o'clock, made calmly, without fuss, by a groom who simply crosses out one time in his own small book and writes in another. And this really is the entire art of running a house like this one. Not the absence of problems, because problems arrive constantly, a guest changing her plans, a fire that will not draw properly, a delivery that comes late, but the absolute refusal to let any problem become visible above the particular invisible line that separates the working house from the living one. By 10:30, less than 5 hours after that telegram arrived, the blue room stands ready, warm, fresh, flowered, entirely prepared to receive a guest who will have no idea, walking into it later that morning, that this room did not simply exist in this state permanently, waiting only for her. Breakfast finished, the morning at Highclere settles into the loose, unstructured rhythm that made country house visits, whatever else you might say about them, genuinely restful for the people living inside them. There is no schedule in the sense we would recognize one today. Nobody is required to be anywhere at any particular time until luncheon, and what fills the hours between is largely a matter of personal inclination, weather, and whatever quiet agreements get made over the breakfast table about who might like to do what with whom. Mrs. Aldworth, finished with her tea and her letters, drifts toward the library, a long room lined floor to ceiling with books that had been accumulating in this particular house for generations. Leather spines gone soft with handling, the specific smell that old paper and old leather and years of coal smoke create together, a smell that does not really exist anywhere else, and that anyone who grew up around houses like this one would recognize instantly, decades later, from a single breath of it. She is not there to read anything in particular. She settles into a deep chair near the window, finds a novel she started the day before, and reads for perhaps 40 minutes in a silence broken only by the occasional turn of a page and, somewhere outside, a gardener's shears working steadily along a hedge. There is correspondence to answer too, and a small writing desk near the window has been provided in her room specifically for this purpose, stocked with paper bearing the house's own crest, because a guest of Mrs. Aldworth's standing is expected to conduct at least some of her ordinary correspondence during a stay, rather than simply setting the whole of her life aside for a week. She writes to her sister, a reply to the letter that arrived this morning, 3 pages in a hand that Sarah will later blot carefully before it goes down to be posted with the rest of the household's outgoing mail, collected each afternoon by the same groom who brings the incoming post up from the village. Outside, the gardens are having their own morning, entirely separate from the house and yet completely in service to it. Highclere's grounds run to hundreds of acres, parkland designed generations earlier by hands that thought in terms of decades and centuries rather than seasons, cedar trees planted so long ago that nobody currently on the staff remembers their planting, only their maintenance. Closer to the house, though, in the walled kitchen garden that most guests never think to visit, an entirely different kind of work is happening, and it is worth a few minutes of our time tonight because it explains something about how a house like this fed itself. The kitchen garden supplies an enormous portion of what appears on the table upstairs. Vegetables grown in careful rotation, fruit trained flat against warm brick walls to ripen earlier and more reliably than they would growing freely. Glass houses producing grapes and peaches months before either would naturally exist in an English climate. a head gardener commanding his own staff of under-gardeners with an authority as absolute within his walled kingdom as the housekeepers within hers, has already been out since before 6, checking what is ready to be cut this morning, because the cook needs to know by mid-morning exactly what the garden can supply for that evening's dinner, and planning a menu without that information would be, in a house this size, simply impossible. Flowers, too, come from this same garden, cut fresh most mornings and carried up to the house to be arranged throughout the public rooms, on the breakfast table, in the hall, in whichever bedroom happens to need them, as we saw happening for the Blue Room not an hour ago. A house this size might use dozens of stems a day without anyone above stairs ever pausing to wonder where they came from or who cut them, which is again precisely the point. By 11 o'clock, the motor car has already left for the station, an early Edwardian model, still something of a novelty even among households wealthy enough to own one, sharing space in the stable yard with horses and carriages in a genuinely strange and transitional arrangement that anyone visiting the estate at this exact moment in history would have found remarkable, though the household itself had already grown used to it. It is worth sitting with that fact for a moment. This house, this particular June, holds inside it a stable full of horses tended by grooms whose methods had not fundamentally changed in 100 years, and a motor car that required an entirely new set of skills nobody in the stable yard had known 5 years earlier. Electric light exists in some rooms of the house and not others. A telephone connects the house to the outside world in a way that would have seemed like something from a novel to anyone living here even 20 years before, and yet letters are still carried by a groom on horseback from the village because that remains, for most purposes, simply faster and more reliable than the alternative. Nobody living through this moment thought of it as transitional, they thought of it as Tuesday. The motor car reaches the station just as the 11 o'clock train pulls in, and Lady Beauchamp steps down onto the platform in travelling clothes, a long dust coat over her dress, a veil pinned to her hat against the dust and smoke of the journey, followed by her own maid and a porter already struggling with the first of what will turn out to be 5 trunks, more than expected, which the groom notes without comment and simply adjusts for. There is a particular kind of luggage a woman of this standing travelled with in 1911 that is worth pausing on, because it is not simply clothes thrown into a case the way we might pack today. There are separate trunks for day dresses and evening dresses, kept apart specifically so the evening things would not crush or wrinkle under the weight of day wear. There is a hat box, sometimes 2, built specifically to protect wide Edwardian hats from being crushed in transit, an entire piece of luggage dedicated to headwear alone. There is a dressing case, small enough to travel inside the carriage rather than in the luggage van, holding brushes, jewellery, the most immediate necessities, because a lady never wants to be separated from these particular items even for the length of a train journey. Her greeting at the house, when the motor car returns, is warm and entirely unhurried, the housekeeper on hand to show her personally to the Blue Room, which by now looks and genuinely feels as though it has been ready and waiting for days. Lady Beauchamp notices the flowers on the dressing table and remarks on them, pleased, with no idea at all that they were cut from the garden less than 4 hours earlier, specifically because of a telegram that arrived while she was still asleep on a train somewhere south of London. Her maid begins unpacking almost immediately, working with the housemaid assigned to help her, the 2 of them lifting dresses from trunks and hanging them in the room's large wardrobe with a speed and care that comes from having done this exact task in dozens of different houses over the years, because a lady's maid who travelled with her mistress became, in her own way, an expert in the particular geography of guest bedrooms across half the country. Lady Beauchamp herself, meanwhile, has already been shown down to where the rest of the party is gathering before luncheon, and this is worth noting because the transition from travel dust to social readiness happens with a speed that would be impossible without an entire staff working just out of sight to make it so. She washes quickly, changes out of her travelling dress into something suitable for the middle of the day, and appears in the drawing room looking, to anyone who did not know she had been on a train 2 hours earlier, as though she had simply stepped down from her own bedroom after a leisurely morning, exactly like everyone else in the room. Luncheon itself, when it comes, is a lighter affair than dinner will be tonight, though lighter in a country house of this standing is a relative term. Cold meats, a light fish course perhaps, salads from the kitchen garden we visited a little while ago, fruit, a modest selection of wine for anyone who wants it, though luncheon wine was generally taken with more restraint than the evening's much larger selection. The company gathers in the dining room around 1 o'clock, seating considerably less formal than dinner, conversation ranging easily across the morning's activities, the horse someone still wants to buy, a letter someone received with interesting news from London, Lady Beauchamp's journey and her account of a fellow passenger who talked without pause from London to nearly the Hampshire border. It is, on the surface, an entirely ordinary meal among entirely ordinary people enjoying an entirely ordinary summer visit. And that surface, that carefully maintained appearance of effortless ordinary comfort, is really the whole point of everything we have watched happen so far this morning. Nobody at that table is thinking about fires laid before dawn, or water carried up narrow stairs, or a telegram that reorganized 5 hours of somebody else's labor. They are simply having lunch in a warm room with good food and good company, exactly as though rooms simply arrived warm and food simply arrived good, without any human effort standing behind either. The afternoon opens itself out slowly after luncheon, the way afternoons in a house like this always did. Less a scheduled block of time than a loose collection of possibilities that different members of the party drift toward according to their own inclinations. Some of the men, and Lady Beauchamp's husband among them, having arrived separately the day before on business that kept him in London a little longer than his wife, go down to the stables to look over the horses, because a country house visit without at least some conversation about horses would have felt, to most of this particular generation, faintly incomplete. Down at the stables, 1911 holds both worlds at once, the old and the arriving new, standing almost literally side by side in the same stone yard, straw and warm animal breath mixing, oddly, with the faint smell of oil and petrol drifting from the far corner. A dozen horses, hunters mostly, kept in beautiful condition by a head groom who has spent his entire working life with animals and who speaks about them with a fluency and tenderness he would never think to apply to a person, calling each one by name in a low voice as he moves down the line of stalls each morning. And parked in what used to be additional stalls, now converted, sits the motor car that collected Lady Beauchamp from the station this morning, tended by a chauffeur whose skills are entirely mechanical rather than equestrian, a young man who trained on engines rather than animals, and who the older grooms regard with a mixture of suspicion and grudging respect that neither side quite knows what to do with yet. Someone suggests a ride before tea, and within 20 minutes 3 horses are saddled and 3 riders, Lady Beauchamp's husband among them, are out across the parkland, moving at an easy pace along paths that generations of the family have ridden before them, past the cedar trees, along the edge of parkland that stretches out further than the eye can comfortably follow. It is a genuine pleasure, unhurried, the kind of afternoon activity that asks nothing of the rider except enjoyment. And it asks a great deal, quietly, of the groom left behind managing the stable yard, and of the horses themselves, and of an entire structure of care and feeding and exercise that keeps a dozen animals ready to be saddled at short notice on any given afternoon a guest happens to want them. Back at the house, Mrs. Aldworth has chosen a walk instead, out through the formal gardens close to the house and then further, along a path that skirts the edge of the parkland, in the company of the Yorkshire couple from breakfast, conversation drifting easily between nothing much and quite a lot, the way conversation does among people who like each other and have several unstructured hours to fill. She has changed, of course, into a walking dress more practical than what she wore at luncheon, sturdier boots, a hat secured firmly enough to survive a breeze, another small change in a day that will eventually total 5 or 6 of them, each one requiring Sarah's attention somewhere upstairs, waiting ready between the moments she is actually needed. By 4 o'clock the household has gathered again, this time in the drawing room, for one of the genuinely cosiest rituals of the entire English country house day. Afternoon tea at Highclere in 1911 is not simply a drink. It is a full small meal laid out on low tables with a care that rivals anything served at dinner, and it exists specifically to provide a warm, unhurried social pause in the middle of an afternoon that might otherwise stretch too long and too empty between luncheon and dressing for the evening. There are sandwiches cut thin, crusts removed, cucumber and thinly sliced ham, and something with watercress, arranged on tiered stands that a footman brings in and sets down with a care that suggests the arrangement itself matters as much as the food. There are scones, still faintly warm from the kitchen, with jam made in the still room from fruit grown in the same walled garden we visited this morning, and cream thick enough to hold its shape on a spoon. There are small cakes, delicate things that took a kitchen maid the better part of an hour to ice properly, arranged in patterns nobody upstairs will particularly notice but that mattered, quietly, to whoever made them. Tea itself is poured from a silver pot by whichever woman present has, by unspoken agreement, taken on the role of pouring, usually the hostess or the most senior woman in the room, a small social duty that carried its own particular weight and etiquette. Conversation at tea tends toward the easy and the domestic. The ride that afternoon, a piece of gossip from London relayed in someone's letter, plans loosely forming for the following day. It is in its way the warmest and cosiest hour of the entire day, a fire in the grate even in June, because English country houses hold a chill that no season entirely dispels. Low light beginning to slant differently through the windows as the afternoon edges toward evening, everyone gathered together in a single room with nothing more urgent to do than eat small sandwiches and talk. And behind it, as always, an entire kitchen has spent the better part of 2 hours producing food that will be consumed in perhaps 40 unhurried minutes, sandwiches assembled at the last possible moment so the bread would not go dry, scones timed precisely so they would still be warm when the tray reached the drawing room, cakes iced the night before and stored carefully to be perfect this particular afternoon. Once tea has been cleared away and the last crumbs brushed from the drawing room's low tables, the kitchen's attention turns fully and finally toward dinner. And if you want to understand the real distance between how a house like this appeared and how it actually functioned, there is no better place to stand for a few minutes than in that kitchen at 4:30 in the afternoon, 3.5 hours before anyone will sit down to eat. Mrs. Nettlefold has been building toward this moment since before dawn, but the final push begins now, and the kitchen becomes, for the next several hours, something closer to a small factory than the cosy domestic image most people carry of Edwardian cooking. A dinner for a house party of this size, family, guests, and whatever neighbours might have been invited to join for the evening, typically ran to somewhere between 6 and 10 courses. Not because anyone present expected to eat enormous quantities of each one, but because variety and abundance were themselves a form of hospitality, a demonstration, however unspoken, of exactly what kind of household this was. A clear soup, prepared from stock that has itself been simmering, essentially, since the day before, strained and clarified with a technique involving egg whites that takes real skill to execute properly, because a cloudy consommé served at dinner was the kind of small failure that a good cook simply did not allow herself. A fish course, likely from a supplier who brought fresh catch-up from the coast that very morning, because nothing in a house of this standing was served less than fresh if fresh could possibly be managed. An entree, something more elaborate, perhaps a dish built around game if the season allowed it, or a more delicate preparation of poultry, sauced with something that required its own separate reduction simmering in a smaller pan somewhere along the vast kitchen range. A joint, the substantial meat course roasted with a precision about timing that had to account for exactly when the dining room would actually be ready to receive it, not a minute before, not a minute after. A vegetable course or two, drawing directly on what the head gardener had confirmed was ready that morning. A sweet course, several of them typically, because Edwardian dinners rarely stopped at a single dessert. Cheese, fruit, coffee to close the whole evening out properly. Each of these courses required its own preparation timeline, worked backward from 8 o'clock with an obsessive precision that the household would never see and would never think to ask about. The soup needed to be hot but not boiling when it left the kitchen. The fish needed to be plated and sauced within minutes of leaving the pan, or it would suffer for the delay. The joint needed 20 minutes rest after coming out of the oven before it could be carved properly, which meant it had to come out of the oven at a very specific moment, calculated against everything else happening simultaneously across a kitchen where 4 or 5 people were working different stations at once, each depending on the others staying exactly on schedule. And all of this, every single element of it, had to arrive in the dining room hot, in the right order, at precisely the right intervals, carried up from a kitchen in the basement to a dining room a full flight of stairs above it, along a service route designed specifically to make this possible without the food losing its heat or its presentation along the way. Some houses of this era kept warming cupboards near the dining room specifically to manage this final stretch. Footmen moved between kitchen and dining room in a constant silent relay for the better part of 2 hours once dinner actually began, timed against a butler standing near the door who alone held in his head the full rhythm of the evening, when each course should appear, when it should be cleared, when the next one should follow. Nobody at the table that evening will think about any of this. They will simply notice, if they notice anything at all, that the soup was excellent, and move on to whatever conversation currently holds their attention. Upstairs, at almost exactly the same hour, the kitchen begins its serious work. An entirely separate and equally elaborate process is beginning in the bedrooms, because dressing for dinner in a house like this was not something anyone did in 20 minutes. It began, for most of the women in the house, around 6 o'clock, a full 2 hours before dinner would actually be served, and it unfolded with a thoroughness that made the morning's dressing look almost casual by comparison. Mrs. Aldworth returns to her room a little after 5, tired in the pleasant way an afternoon of walking produces, and finds that a bath has already been prepared. Not the full formal bath she takes twice a week, but a proper wash intended specifically to remove the day's dust and freshen her completely before the evening begins. Sarah has laid out the evening's dress already, chosen the night before after a brief consultation about what colours the other women were likely to be wearing, because a hostess or a fellow guest turning up in an eerily similar shade to someone else at the table was the kind of small social embarrassment everyone quietly worked to avoid. The evening dress itself is a different order of garment entirely from anything worn earlier in the day. Silk, in a deep wine colour that suits Mrs. Aldworth's colouring particularly well, with a low neckline appropriate to evening wear that would have been considered entirely inappropriate at any other hour, boning built into the bodice itself to help shape the silhouette over the corset beneath, a train that will need managing carefully on the stairs and through doorways for the rest of the night. It took in many houses of this standing a specific evening corset, laced slightly differently from the daytime version, cut to sit correctly beneath a low neckline and support the particular shape the dress required. Hair comes down again, brushed out from the day's style and rebuilt from scratch for evening, a more elaborate arrangement than the morning's, sometimes incorporating a small ornament, a comb, or a few pins set with paste stones, or, for a woman of real means, something considerably more valuable than paste. And here, finally, comes the evening's real jewellery, brought out from the dressing case that travelled with such care in its own separate compartment of the luggage. A necklace, diamonds perhaps, or garnets if diamonds felt like more than the occasion warranted, clasped carefully at the back of the neck by Sarah's steady fingers, earrings to match, a bracelet, rings already worn but perhaps adjusted or added to for the evening. The whole effect, by the time Sarah steps back to check the result in the long mirror, is genuinely transformed from the woman who came in from her afternoon walk an hour and a half earlier, dusty boots and wind-blown hair replaced entirely by something closer to a small work of art, constructed layer by careful layer by 2 women working together in near total privacy. Gloves, long evening gloves reaching well past the elbow, go on last, after the jewellery, a specific order that avoided snagging delicate silk on a ring or bracelet clasp, another one of those small rules absorbed so completely that nobody staying in this house would ever think to question why it existed. Down the corridor, a broadly similar process is unfolding for the men of the party, though considerably faster and considerably less elaborate. A valet lays out evening dress, white tie by 1911 for a formal dinner of this kind, studs and cufflinks selected and fitted into a fresh shirt, a tailcoat brushed and ready, checking that everything sits correctly across the shoulders with the small adjustments only a trained eye would catch. It takes perhaps 40 minutes rather than the women's nearly 2 hours, a genuine and telling asymmetry in exactly how much labour, both the wearer's own and the labour of the person assisting them, went into looking effortlessly correct for dinner depending entirely on which half of the party you happen to belong to. By 7:45, the house has transformed completely from the loose, comfortable afternoon it was only a few hours earlier. Every guest and family member is dressed, jewelled, and gathered in the drawing room for the pre-dinner gathering, a short interval with sherry offered by a footman before the whole party moves, at a signal from the butler standing quietly near the door, into the dining room itself. The dining room by candlelight and the newer, softer glow of electric lamps fitted with fabric shades to soften their brightness looks like almost nothing else the day has offered so far. The table is laid with a precision that took a footman the better part of an hour to achieve, white linen pressed to a perfect flatness, silver arranged in the correct order outward from each place setting according to the courses about to be served, crystal glasses positioned for wine, water and champagne, each guest's name known in advance and their seat assigned according to a strict order of precedence that the hostess and the butler worked out together earlier that day, because where a person sat at dinner in a house like this said something real about how the household regarded them, and getting it wrong was the kind of mistake that got remembered. Seating itself follows an old and formal logic. The most senior woman present sits to the host's right, the most senior man to the hostess's right, everyone else arranged outward from there according to rank, age, and social standing in a system so precise that experienced hostesses kept small cards or diagrams to plan it in advance, because working it out on the spot, with guests already standing in the drawing room waiting to go in, would have been considered a genuine failure of preparation. Dinner itself unfolds across nearly 2 hours, each course arriving, being served, and being cleared with a rhythm the butler alone controls, standing near enough to the door to catch the smallest signal from the kitchen that the next course is ready, timing its arrival against the state of conversation at the table so that nothing feels rushed and nothing sits waiting to go cold. Footmen move around the table from the left, serving from large dishes held at exactly the correct angle, a skill that took real training to execute smoothly without ever touching a guest's shoulder or dripping so much as a drop of sauce onto the white linen below. Wine is poured, a different vintage for nearly every course, chosen in advance by the butler in consultation with the host, from a cellar that represents in its own quiet way decades of careful acquisition and storage. Conversation at the table flows the way conversation at a well-arranged dinner is supposed to flow, guests speaking primarily to whoever sits on either side of them, the whole table occasionally drawn together by something said loudly enough or interesting enough to catch everyone's attention at once. Lady Beauchamp, seated according to her rank somewhere in the upper half of the table, finds herself deep in conversation about a mutual acquaintance with the man on her right, while further down the table someone tells a story about a hunting mishap that makes half the room laugh. It is by any measure a genuinely pleasant evening, warm and well-fed and easy, exactly the kind of evening that a great house existed to produce. And the entire 2 hours of it rests on a coordination below and behind the visible room that would be, if anyone above stairs actually stopped to consider it, faintly extraordinary. A kitchen staff of perhaps 6 or 7 people, working in a heat that by this point in the evening has built to something genuinely uncomfortable, moving through course after course without a single visible mistake reaching the table above them. A team of footmen who have rehearsed in effect this exact choreography hundreds of times before, each one knowing precisely where to stand, when to move, which side to serve from without needing to be told. A butler holding the entire timeline of the evening in his head, adjusting constantly and invisibly to whatever the actual pace of conversation demands. This is not luck. It is a genuinely skilled performance rehearsed daily for years that simply happens to look from where the guests are sitting like nothing at all. When dinner finally ends, sometime after 10, the women rise first and withdraw to the drawing room, an old custom that by 1911 had softened considerably from its stricter Victorian form, but had not disappeared entirely, leaving the men briefly at the table with port and cigars and whatever conversation men of this era considered unsuitable for mixed company, which in practice usually meant nothing more scandalous than business or politics discussed a little more bluntly than usual. It rarely lasted more than 20 minutes before the men rejoined the women, and the whole party settled into the loose, comfortable second half of the evening that would carry them through to bed. The drawing room after dinner has its own particular warmth, a fire built up properly for the evening, lamps arranged to create pools of soft light rather than one flat brightness across the whole room, coffee brought in on a tray and poured by whichever woman has taken on that particular small duty tonight. Someone plays the piano, not performance exactly, more the easy background music of a person who learnt properly as a girl and still enjoys it. Fingers finding a piece she knows well enough not to need the sheet music in front of her. A card table is set up in one corner for those who want it, bridge mostly, played for stakes small enough to be purely social rather than serious. Lady Beauchamp, tired now from a full day that began on a train and ended in this warm room, settles into conversation with the hostess about nothing in particular, the kind of unhurried talk that fills the final hour of an evening among people who like each other and are in no hurry to end it. By 11, the party is beginning to break up naturally, one guest and then another rising, offering the small formal goodnights of the era and drifting up the grand staircase toward bed. There is no rush to this either. Nobody announces that it is time to retire. People simply, gradually decide they are ready, and the room empties itself over the better part of an hour rather than all at once. Upstairs, Sarah has been waiting, and the moment Mrs. Aldworth's bedroom door closes behind her, the whole elaborate structure built so carefully at 6 o'clock begins, patiently, to come apart again. The gloves come off first, then the jewellery, each piece unclasped and returned to its case with a care that treats a diamond necklace with exactly the same practical attention as a hairpin, because to Sarah, in this particular moment, they are simply items to be looked after correctly rather than symbols of anything grander. The dress is unhooked down the back, the same long row of small fastenings that took Sarah minutes to close now taking almost as long to open, because undoing them carelessly risked tearing silk that had cost more than most people in the village would see in a year. The corset comes off next, and there is a particular moment, familiar to anyone who has ever worn genuinely restrictive clothing for a full day, when the release of it produces an almost audible exhale, a settling of the body back into its own natural shape after hours spent held in someone else's idea of the correct one. Sarah helps her into a warm dressing gown, soft and entirely unglamorous compared to everything that came off in the last 10 minutes, and this quiet, private moment, robe and slippers and a face free of the evening's careful arrangement, is in its own way the most honest hour of Mrs. Aldworth's entire day. Hair comes down last, unpinned strand by strand and brushed out again before being loosely plaited for the night, the same careful 100 strokes, more or less, that opened the day this morning, closing it now in reverse. Sarah lays out tomorrow's early morning things quietly on the chair by the washstand, checks the fire has enough coal to see the room through the first part of the night without needing attention, and asks, as she always does, whether there is anything else needed before she goes. There rarely is. Mrs. Aldworth thanks her genuinely in the easy way of someone who has come to actually like the person who has spent 6 years managing the most physically intimate parts of her daily life, and Sarah slips out, leaving the room lit only by the fire and a single small lamp by the bed. The bed itself, when she finally climbs into it, deserves a few minutes of our attention tonight, because there is something worth understanding about exactly what sleeping inside a house like this actually felt like physically in the body in a way that goes beyond anything we have talked about so far. Her mattress is deep and generously stuffed, horsehair beneath a layer of something softer nearer the surface, set on a frame wide enough that a person could stretch out fully in any direction without ever finding the edge. The sheets are linen, not cotton, cool and slightly crisp against the skin in the way linen always is at first contact, warming quickly once a body settles into them, smelling faintly of the lavender the laundry maids press between folded stacks of clean linen specifically for this purpose. Blankets, wool, heavy enough to hold real warmth against a room that, however carefully the fire has been tended, will still carry a faint chill by 2 or 3 in the morning once that fire has burnt down to embers. A quilted eiderdown sits folded at the foot of the bed, an extra layer available if the night turns colder than expected, which in Hampshire even in June is never entirely out of the question. Goosedown fills the pillows, several of them, arranged to allow a sleeper to prop herself up slightly if she wants to read for a few minutes before actually sleeping, which Mrs. Aldworth does now, a slim volume of poetry rather than the novel from the library, something gentler suited to the particular hour. The lamp beside the bed throws a small warm circle of light across the page and no further, leaving the rest of the room in a soft darkness broken only by the last low glow of the fire across the room, embers rather than flame now, ticking and settling occasionally with a small sound that has become, over 2 nights, oddly comforting rather than distracting. Somewhere outside, faint through heavy curtains and thick old stone walls, an owl calls once, twice, and falls silent. A clock on the mantel ticks steadily, marking time in a room where time for the moment does not particularly matter. Down the corridor, muffled by distance and by walls built generations ago to standards nobody bothers building to anymore, a door closes softly as another guest retires for the night. Somewhere further off, footsteps cross a landing and fade. The house is settling, room by room, the way a great house settles every single night, each occupied bedroom closing itself off into its own small pocket of warmth and privacy, while the vast dark rooms below, the hall, the library, the drawing room, now empty of everyone but a dying fire, stand silent and unused until morning. She reads perhaps 2 poems before her eyes grow heavy enough that the words start slipping past without quite landing, and she sets the book on the nightstand, turns down the lamp, and lies back into pillows still faintly warm from where her body has already shaped them over these past few minutes. The room falls into a near total darkness, fire embers the only remaining light, and within a few minutes her breathing has settled into the slow, even rhythm of a person who has walked several miles that afternoon, danced no particular dance but performed, in her own quiet way, an entire day's worth of careful physical and social choreography, and is now, finally, simply asleep. Down the corridor, in the blue room that was, this same morning, still under dust sheets with no idea it would be needed today at all, Lady Beauchamp is going through a nearly identical version of this same quiet ritual, her own maid performing the same careful sequence of unclasping and unhooking and unpinning that we just watched Sarah perform 2 doors away. It is a strange thing to sit with for a moment, how uniform this particular hour was across an entire floor of very different bedrooms, each one holding a different woman with her own particular history and her own particular thoughts, and yet each one closing her day through nearly the same sequence of small physical acts, performed by another woman whose own day had begun hours before her mistress's and would not, in fact, be finished for some while yet. Lady Beauchamp thinks as she settles into a bed that this morning did not exist for her at all, about the day, about the ride her husband described at dinner, about a small piece of gossip exchanged over coffee that she intends to mention in a letter tomorrow. She does not think about the telegram because she never knew there was a telegram, never knew that her own change of plans that morning had set an entire quiet machine into motion 5 hours ahead of schedule. To her, this room simply exists, has always existed, warm and ready and slightly scented with fresh flowers, exactly as it appears to exist for every guest who has ever stayed in it. That seamlessness, that complete erasure of the labour behind it is not an accident. It is the entire point of the household's existence, and by any honest measure it succeeded completely tonight. Further along the corridor, in the rooms belonging to the family rather than the guests, a similar quiet is settling in, though with the particular ease that comes from being in one's own home rather than someone else's, however grand the hospitality. The Countess, if we imagine her in this scene, has her own version of this same evening ritual, performed by her own long-serving maid, in a bedroom that holds decades of her own particular history rather than the temporary arrangement of a guest room. Photographs on the mantel of children now grown, a writing desk worn smooth at the edges from years of use, a shape to the whole room that fits her the way a well-worn glove fits a hand. Not everyone in the house is asleep yet, though. Down in the servants' hall and in the kitchen below it, the day is very much still going, and will continue going for a good while longer, because dinner does not simply end when the last guest leaves the dining room. It ends properly hours later, once an entirely separate sequence of work has run its full course. The dining room itself is cleared first. The moment the last of the party has moved through to the drawing room, footmen working quickly and quietly to clear the table completely, carrying dishes, glasses and silver back down to the kitchen passage in relays that mirror in reverse the relay that brought each course up hours earlier. The tablecloth comes off, is checked for stains, and goes to the laundry pile that will be dealt with properly tomorrow. Candles, if any were used rather than purely electric light, are extinguished and the stubs collected, because even candle stubs had value and were not simply thrown away in a well-run household of this era. Silver, once cleared, does not simply get put away, it gets counted, every single piece, checked against a list the butler keeps specifically for this purpose, a task that sounds almost paranoid until you understand that silver represented a genuinely significant portion of a house's total wealth, and that a butler who could not account for every fork and spoon at the end of an evening was not doing his job properly. This counting happens quietly, methodically in the butler's own pantry, a small secure room off the kitchen passage where the good silver lives when it is not in use, locked in a cupboard the butler alone holds the key to. While the butler counts silver, a very different kind of work is happening in the scullery, the small stone-floored room off the main kitchen where the least glamorous labour of the entire household concentrates itself at the end of every single day. A scullery maid, likely the youngest and most junior member of the kitchen staff, stands at a deep stone sink working through what looks at this hour like an almost endless procession of dishes, pots, pans and serving vessels, water gone lukewarm hours ago now barely warm at all, hands red and pruned from a full day of exactly this kind of work. There is a particular hierarchy even within washing up. The good china handled with real care, rinsed and dried by hand rather than left to air dry the way lesser crockery might be, because a chip in the good service was the kind of small disaster that could be noticed and remarked upon at breakfast the following morning, and remarking upon it was not something any servant wanted directed toward themselves. The heavy copper pans that Mrs. Nettlefold cooked the evening sauces in require their own particular scrubbing. Copper being a metal that shows every mark and demands a specific kind of attention that the scullery maid has, over months of practice, come to perform almost without thinking about it. This work will not finish most nights until well past midnight, and the girl performing it knows, without needing to check a clock, that she is perhaps 5 or 6 hours before she needs to be up again herself, beginning a new day that will look, in its broad outlines, almost exactly like this one, before circling back to this same sink at roughly this same hour tomorrow night. Upstairs from the scullery, in the servants' hall itself, the household's other work of the late evening continues in a lower, gentler register. Tomorrow's clothes are being prepared even now. Valets and ladies' maids brushing down the evening's discarded garments, hanging dresses and coats in the specific way that helps them hold their shape overnight, checking hems and seams for anything that might need small repair before the item is worn again. Shoes worn to dinner join tomorrow's collection waiting to be polished before dawn. The same quiet cycle we watched begin this story many hours ago, already beginning to repeat itself. The housekeeper makes a final round of the ground floor rooms, checking fires in the library and drawing room, banking them down rather than letting them burn out entirely or extinguishing them completely, a specific skill involving how the coals are arranged that keeps a low heat through the night without wasting fuel or risking anything unsafe. She checks that windows are properly latched, that the room where the day's post was written and answered has been left tidy, that nothing has been left out of place that a family member might notice and comment on tomorrow. This is her last task of a day that began, like everyone else's below stairs, well before dawn, and there is a particular satisfaction in it. The quiet confirmation that everything, genuinely everything, across an enormous house full of moving parts, ended the day exactly where it was supposed to end. Silver counted and locked away. The butler makes his own final circuit, checking the main doors are bolted, the entrance hall dark except for a single low lamp left burning for anyone who might still be moving through the house, though by this hour that is unlikely. He pauses, sometimes in the hall itself, looking up the grand staircase toward the darkened corridors above, a moment nobody sees and nobody would think to ask him about, the closest thing to a private thought most butlers of this era permitted themselves during working hours. There is one part of the household's daily labour we have not properly visited tonight, and it deserves a few minutes now in this quieter stretch of the evening, because without it almost nothing else we have described would have been possible. The laundry. A house like this one, with a family, a rotating cast of guests, and a full staff of servants, generates an almost unbelievable quantity of linen and clothing requiring regular washing, and in 1911, before the widespread arrival of anything resembling a mechanical washing machine in domestic use, nearly all of it was done by hand, or with the assistance of large but still fundamentally manual equipment by a team of laundry maids working in a separate building or wing set apart from the main house specifically because the process itself, involving enormous quantities of hot water, steam and strong soap, was neither pleasant nor compatible with the rest of the household's daily life. Sheets alone, changed regularly in every occupied bedroom, represented an enormous ongoing task. Add tablecloths and napkins from every meal, the family and staff's personal clothing, the elaborate underlayers of every woman's daily wardrobe we have spent so much of tonight discussing, and the true scale of the operation becomes clear. Washing day in most households of this size was not actually a single day but a rolling, nearly continuous process. Different categories of linen and clothing moving through washing, drying and ironing on a staggered schedule that meant the laundry maid's work, much like the kitchen's, essentially never fully stopped. Water had to be heated in large coppers, clothes and linens sorted by fabric and by how soiled they were, the most delicate items, evening silks and fine lace, handled entirely separately from the sturdier cottons and linens that could withstand more vigorous treatment. Washing itself was physical labour in the most literal sense, hands submerged in hot soapy water for hours, heavy wet fabric wrung out by hand or through a mangle, a hand-cranked device that pressed water out between two rollers, itself requiring real strength to operate for any length of time. Drying happened outdoors when weather allowed, on lines strung across a laundry yard invisible from anywhere the family might walk, or indoors on wooden racks near a fire when it did not. And then, perhaps most demanding of all, ironing, an entire skill in itself. Irons heated on a small stove kept specifically for that purpose. Different weights and shapes of iron for different tasks. a fine lace collar requiring an entirely different touch than a heavy linen sheet. A good laundry maid could press a man's dress shirt to a standard that would satisfy the most particular valet, the collar and cuffs crisp enough to hold their shape through an entire evening. And this skill, like so many others in this house, was learned slowly through years of practice and noticed by almost nobody except the rare occasion something went wrong. The linen cupboards themselves, which the housekeeper oversees with real seriousness, hold the accumulated product of all this work, shelves of folded sheets and pillowcases and towels arranged by size and quality, lavender sachets tucked between the folds, everything organized with a precision that meant any housemaid at any hour could find exactly what a given bedroom needed without delay or confusion. It is worth remembering the next time you picture a perfectly made bed in a house like this, that the crisp linen on it was the product of an entire separate department of skilled, physically demanding labor that most guests across their entire stay would never once think about, let alone see. By the time the last dish has been dried and put away, and the last fire banked for the night, it is often approaching 1 in the morning, and the servants themselves finally begin making their way to their own beds, up a different staircase entirely from the one the family and guests climbed hours earlier, narrower, plainer, leading to a floor of small rooms tucked under the roofline where the ceiling slopes down at the edges and the windows, when there are windows at all, are considerably smaller than anything below. The arrangements here follow their own strict rules, as formal in their way as anything governing the dining room downstairs. Male and female servants sleep in entirely separate wings or corridors, sometimes with a locked door between them that only the housekeeper or butler holds a key to, a rule enforced with real seriousness in most households of this era, reflecting both the moral standards of the time and a genuine concern for the reputation of any household where staff might be suspected of impropriety. The most senior servants, the housekeeper and the butler particularly, often have their own private rooms, a small mark of status within a hierarchy that extended in its own way even up here under the roof. More junior servants share rooms, 2 housemaids to a space not much larger than the bedroom Mrs. Aldworth is currently sleeping in alone 2 floors below, though considerably plainer, a washstand, 2 narrow beds, perhaps a small shared chest of drawers for the few personal possessions a servant's position and wages allowed them to accumulate. Tom, the hall boy we met building the kitchen fire before dawn this morning, is long since asleep by this hour, has been for some time, exhausted in the particular way a 15-year-old body gets exhausted after a day that began before 5 and involved constant physical labor from that hour onward. He will be up again in a little over 3 hours, the whole cycle beginning fresh, and there is something worth sitting with in that fact for a moment, the genuine physical toll of a system that produced for the people upstairs an experience of total effortless comfort, resting on the considerably less comfortable and considerably shorter nights of the people who made that comfort possible. This is not, I want to say clearly, a simple story of villains and victims. Service in a great house like Highclere was, for many who worked in it, a genuinely respectable career, offering food, shelter, and wages that compared favourably to many alternatives available to working-class men and women in Edwardian England, along with a structured path of advancement that a talented and ambitious servant could genuinely climb, hallboy to footman to butler, or housemaid to lady's maid to, eventually, if she was skilled and fortunate, housekeeper of her own great house somewhere. Many servants took real pride in their work, in a well-run dinner service, in a room prepared perfectly, in the quiet competence that this entire story has spent so long describing. But it was also, undeniably, hard physical labor performed across very long days by people whose comfort mattered considerably less in the structure of the house itself than the comfort of the people they served, and both of those things can be true at once, without contradiction, the way most honest history usually turns out to be more complicated than either the golden version or the grim version alone. Let us walk for a few minutes through the grand rooms of the house itself, now that everyone who might have used them tonight has gone to bed, because there is something genuinely strange and rather beautiful about a house like this one after midnight, when the room's built specifically to hold dozens of people, to be looked at, admired, filled with conversation and candlelight and the rustle of evening silk, stand instead in complete darkness and complete silence, waiting for a morning that is still hours away. The saloon, the great central room of the house, rises up through more than one story, its walls hung with paintings that generations of the family collected and commissioned, faces looking down now on nothing but darkness and the faint gleam of moonlight, when there is moonlight, catching along a gilded frame or the polished surface of a table nobody is currently sitting at. By day this room holds the particular hum of a house receiving guests, footsteps crossing its floor, voices rising and falling under its high ceiling. At 1 in the morning it holds nothing but its own scale, its own silence, a room built for hundreds of years of use standing, for this particular stretch of hours, entirely unused. Mrs. Aldworth's library, where she spent a contented 40 minutes reading this morning, is dark now too, its books settled into their shelves, the deep chair by the window empty, the smell of old leather and paper the same as it was at midday but somehow more noticeable in the stillness, the way smells often are when there is nothing else competing for attention. The fire the housekeeper banked earlier gives off the faintest orange glow, barely enough to see by, hardly enough to read by, though if you stood in the doorway long enough your eyes would adjust and the room would slowly reveal itself, shelf by shelf, chair by chair, exactly where it was left. Up the grand staircase, past portraits of ancestors whose names most current guests could not reliably recite, the landing above stands in near total darkness except for a single low lamp the butler left burning, casting just enough light to find one's way by without illuminating much of anything beyond the first few steps. This staircase, wide enough for several people to descend together in full evening dress without brushing against one another, wide enough to have been designed quite deliberately as a kind of stage for exactly the sort of grand entrance a hostess might want to make before a room full of guests, now holds nobody at all, its width and its grandeur entirely wasted on an empty house in the middle of the night, waiting patiently for tomorrow evening to give it a reason to matter again. It is worth pausing here to think about what all of this space, all of this grandeur was actually for, because a house like Highclere in 1911 existed inside a very particular social culture, the culture of the English country house visit, and understanding that culture helps explain why an entire household of 25 or 30 people existed specifically to support what might look, from the outside, like an unreasonably elaborate way to have a few friends stay for a week. A country house visit of this era was not simply a social occasion. It was a genuine institution with its own unwritten rules and its own real economic and social function. Invitations mattered enormously, who received them, who did not, how far in advance they arrived, how they were worded. A family's standing could be measured in part by whose houses they were invited to and who accepted invitations to their own. Marriages were made during these visits, business connections formed over the very kind of unhurried afternoon conversation we watched happen earlier today, political alliances quietly cemented over port after the women had withdrawn from the dining room. The entire apparatus we have spent this whole story exploring, the fires, the meals, the elaborate dressing, the perfectly timed dinner service, existed in service of something that mattered a great deal to the people involved in it, however strange or excessive it might look from a century's distance. It is worth returning for a few minutes to something we touched on earlier today, standing in the stable yard with its horses and its motor car side by side. Because 1911 really was a genuinely strange moment to be living inside a house like this one, caught between two entirely different ways of running a household, neither one fully replacing the other yet. The telephone at Highclere by this point connects the house to the outside world in a way that would have seemed close to magic to anyone standing in these same rooms even 15 years earlier, though using it involved a process considerably less immediate than anyone today would recognize. A call did not simply connect, It went first to a local exchange, an operator, often a young woman working in a small office in the nearest town, who physically connected one line to another by hand, and reaching anyone beyond the immediate local area could take real time, sometimes minutes, sometimes considerably longer if the lines were busy or the connection poor. The instrument itself sits in a small room set aside specifically for the purpose, not in every bedroom or even every reception room, because a telephone in 1911 was still enough of a novelty and enough of an oddity within an old house's established rhythms that it had not yet found its way into general daily use the way it eventually would. Most of the household's actual communication still travels by letter or by telegram, carried in and out by the same groom who rides down to the village each morning, a system that had worked reliably for generations and that nobody felt any particular urgency to abandon simply because a newer alternative existed. Electric light tells a similar story of partial, uneven arrival. Some rooms in the house, the principal reception rooms particularly, had been fitted with electric lighting in recent years, wired in by workmen who had to run new cable through walls built centuries before anyone imagined such a thing would be necessary. The light itself softened by fabric shades because raw electric bulbs, to eyes accustomed to candlelight and gas, felt uncomfortably harsh and bright. Other parts of the house, particularly the older servants' quarters up under the roof, still relied on candles or oil lamps well into this same period, which meant a housemaid climbing to her attic room at the end of a long day might do so by candlelight in a house where, 2 floors below her, guests had spent the evening under electric lamps. An odd and rarely remarked upon asymmetry that nobody currently living in the house thought to find strange because it was simply how things were. Plumbing followed its own uneven path too. The full bathroom Mrs. Aldworth uses twice a week with its large copper tub and running water represents genuine modern comfort for this era, but it exists down the hall rather than attached to her own room, shared among several bedrooms rather than private to any one of them, which meant a certain amount of the same careful scheduling and coordination that governed everything else in this house, the housekeeper keeping a mental note of who had used it when, ensuring the hot water arrived at the right time for whoever needed it next. Most washing, as we saw this morning, still happened the older way at a washstand, with water carried up by hand, a system that had not fundamentally changed in generations even as the house around it slowly, unevenly acquired the conveniences of a new century. None of this felt, to anyone living through it, like a story about progress arriving. It felt like Tuesday, then Wednesday, then Thursday, ordinary days accumulating into an ordinary life that happened to sit at a genuinely unusual hinge point in history, old ways and new ways occupying the same rooms, sometimes the same hour, without either one particularly announcing itself as more significant than the other. Let us spend a few minutes now with the housekeeper herself, because we have followed her through this entire day, her hands on the keys at her belt, her quiet reorganization of 5 hours of preparation when that telegram arrived this morning, and she deserves, before the night closes in fully, a little more than the sum of her tasks. Her name, let us say, is Mrs. Ferris, though the title itself is a courtesy, a mark of her senior position rather than any statement about her actual marital status, a small linguistic convention of the era that applied to housekeepers regardless of whether they had ever married at all. She is 53, has worked in service since she was 14 years old, beginning as a scullery maid in a considerably smaller house in Wiltshire and rising, over nearly 4 decades, through every rung of the female hierarchy we discussed earlier today: housemaid, under housekeeper, and finally, for the last 12 years, housekeeper of Highclere itself, one of the most significant positions a woman in her circumstances could realistically hope to reach. She has never married, a fact that was, for a housekeeper of this era, less unusual than it might sound today, the position itself demanding a kind of total availability and total commitment that made balancing it with a household and family of one's own genuinely difficult, and many women in her position simply chose or found themselves choosing the career over the alternative. She has instead something close to real authority within a world that offered women of her class remarkably little of it elsewhere. 20 female servants answer to her directly. She manages a budget that runs to real money, negotiates with tradesmen, makes decisions daily that affect the comfort and reputation of one of the most significant houses in the county, and does all of this with a quiet, unshowy competence that the family upstairs has come, over 12 years, to depend on completely without ever quite articulating how much they depend on it. Tonight, before she finally climbs the stairs to her own room, considerably more comfortable than the attic rooms her junior housemaids share, a private space with its own small sitting area that reflects her seniority, she sits for a few minutes at her own desk in the housekeeper's room, going through tomorrow's requirements in the same small book that guided this morning's fire schedule. Lady Beauchamp's early arrival has been noted and dealt with. Tomorrow's breakfast, luncheon and dinner have already been discussed with the cook. The linen due to go to the laundry tomorrow is listed. It is in its way not so different from the kind of work a modern hotel manager or an operations director might recognize, though nobody in 1911 would have described it in those terms, and nobody, least of all Mrs. Ferris herself, would have thought to ask whether the sheer scale of what she managed daily deserved a different kind of recognition than a single small word. Housekeeper, sitting quietly beneath a much grander title on the floor above her. She closes the book, blows out her candle, and climbs the stairs to a bed that she, unlike most of her staff, does not share with anyone, in a room she has occupied for 12 years and has come, in her own quiet way, to think of as genuinely her own, the closest thing to a home of her own choosing that a life spent almost entirely in service to other people's houses ever really allowed her. Outside, if you could stand for a moment, on the lawn where we began this story so many hours ago, the house now looks almost exactly as it did before dawn this morning, dark, still, giving away nothing at all about the 20 hours of continuous, careful labour that just passed through it. A few windows show the faintest last traces of light, a lamp not quite extinguished, embers still glowing faintly behind heavy curtains, but from any real distance the house reads as simply asleep, exactly the illusion it was designed, generation after generation, to project. The Hampshire countryside around it is fully dark now, no artificial light for miles beyond the house itself and the small scattered lights of the village down the hill, a darkness that people living in cities even in 1911 had already largely lost, and that people living here had never particularly noticed they still had. Somewhere out past the cedar trees, an owl calls again, the same one perhaps that Mrs. Aldworth heard faintly through her window a few hours ago, now hunting in earnest across parkland that has belonged to this house for so long that the land itself seems to have absorbed something of its rhythms. A fox crosses the lawn at some point in these small hours, the way foxes do, entirely indifferent to the enormous quiet building beside it, to the sleeping family and sleeping guests and sleeping servants inside, to the whole elaborate human structure of hierarchy and service and comfort that means nothing whatsoever to a fox crossing a lawn at 2 a.m. in search of something to eat. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a house like this in the deepest part of the night, different from the silence of an ordinary house because it carries within it the memory of so much recent activity, so many footsteps, so many voices, so much careful coordinated motion, all of it stilled now but somehow still present in the air, the way a room feels different after a party than it did before one, even once every guest has gone and every light has been turned off. The dining room, cleared and reset for tomorrow's breakfast, sits in this particular kind of charged emptiness. The kitchen, its great range banked down to a bare simmering warmth that will make tomorrow's early fire building considerably easier than if it had gone out completely, holds the ghost of everything that was cooked there today. A smell of roasted meat and baked bread and coal smoke that will still be faintly present when Tom comes down in a little over 3 hours to begin the whole cycle again. And there really is the answer to the question we started with tonight, all those hours ago, standing on this same dark lawn wondering how a house holding this many people, this many meals, this many fires, this many small daily crises could possibly appear as peaceful and effortless as it does from the outside? The answer is not magic, and it is not quite an accident either. It is 25 or 30 people, each trained for years in a specific and demanding skill, working in a coordination so precise it looks, from any distance at all, like nothing is happening. It is a housekeeper who reorganizes 5 hours of preparation without a single visible sign of strain. It is a cook who holds an entire day's meals in her head before the sun has properly risen. It is a hall boy who will be on his knees in front of a cold grate again in a little over 3 hours, doing exactly what he did this morning, exactly what he will do tomorrow morning, exactly what boys in his position did in this house for generations before electric light or motor cars or telephones ever arrived to complicate just slightly the old and steady rhythm of the work. We have spent most of tonight following the household from below stairs and the world of the women upstairs. But there is another side of this same day worth a few minutes of our time, because the man at the head of this house had his own version of hidden labour too, less physically demanding than a housemaid's but no less constant, and it unfolded largely out of sight of everyone we have followed so far. He was awake by 7, considerably later than his staff, but earlier than most of his guests, and spent the better part of an hour before breakfast in a small study set apart from the more social rooms of the house, going through correspondence of an entirely different character than the letters Mrs. Aldworth answered at her writing desk. Estate business filled most of it, a tenant farmer requesting repairs to a barn roof damaged in a recent storm. A letter from the land agent, the man employed specifically to manage the day-to-day business of an estate running to several thousand acres, regarding rents due at the end of the quarter and a dispute between 2 tenants over a boundary hedge that had apparently been simmering for months. A note from a solicitor in London concerning a matter of investment that required a decision, one way or another, by the end of the week. A house like Highclere, however much it might present itself as a place of pure leisure to its guests, existed at the centre of a genuinely substantial working enterprise, farms and cottages, and a whole small economy of tenants and labourers whose livelihoods depended, in real and direct ways, on decisions made quietly in this small book-lined study before most of the house had even finished breakfast. The land agent came up to the house later that same morning while Mrs. Aldworth was in the library and the riders were out across the parkland for a meeting that lasted the better part of an hour, walking through the barn roof, the boundary dispute, and half a dozen smaller matters with the particular unhurried thoroughness that estate business seemed to demand of everyone involved in it. This work, like the housekeepers and the cooks, remained almost entirely invisible to the guests moving through the more social parts of the house that same morning. Nobody at luncheon asked about the barn roof. Nobody at afternoon tea wondered aloud how the boundary dispute had been resolved. And yet this quieter, more business-like side of the day was, in its own way, just as essential to the continued existence of everything else we have watched happen. The fires and the fresh flowers and the elaborate dinners all resting, ultimately, on an income that depended on tenant farms being properly managed, rents being properly collected, and a whole surrounding economy being kept in reasonably good working order by a man who spent an hour of his morning at a desk doing something that looked from the outside considerably less glamorous than anything happening in the drawing room. By midday, the estate business set aside until tomorrow, he had rejoined the social rhythm of the house entirely, and nobody watching him at luncheon, easy and unhurried and entirely present in the conversation about the horse someone still wanted to buy, would have guessed that 2 hours earlier he had been discussing hedge boundaries with the seriousness of a man running, because in every meaningful sense he was, a genuine business. Up on the top floor of the house, in a suite of rooms set apart from both the family's own bedrooms and the servants' quarters, a different rhythm entirely governs the day, because a house like this one, if it holds young children, holds an entire small world built specifically around them, largely separate from everything we have followed so far tonight. If we imagine the family at Highclere in this particular June holding a daughter of 6 and a son of 4, Both children would have spent this day almost entirely within the nursery wing, in the care of a nanny who has in many such households more daily influence over a child's early years than either parent, and a nursery maid who assists her with the constant physical labour that small children require regardless of what century or what social class surrounds them. The children woke early, breakfasted on simple food considerably plainer than anything served downstairs, porridge and bread and milk rather than kedgeree and kidneys, dressed in clothes suited to a morning of play rather than a morning of visiting, and spent much of the day exactly where children of any era spend their days when left largely to their own devices under kind supervision, outside when the weather allowed it. They would have seen their mother in a household following the conventions of this era for a defined and fairly brief period each day rather than continuously, a formal visit to the nursery after breakfast, perhaps another briefly before the evening's dressing began, structured moments of parental attention bookending a day otherwise filled almost entirely by the nanny's care rather than the mother's own. This arrangement, which can look strange or even cold from a modern vantage point, was simply the accepted structure of upper-class childhood in this era, and within it genuine warmth and genuine affection existed just as they exist in any family, expressed through the particular shape this particular era's customs allowed rather than through the constant physical presence a different century might expect. The nursery itself held its own small hierarchy of comfort and care that mirrored in miniature everything we have watched happen across the rest of the house today. A fire built each morning, just as in every other occupied room. Meals carried up on trays from the same kitchen producing the elaborate dinner downstairs, though considerably simpler in content. A bath prepared each evening, water carried up the same back stairs that carried water to every other bedroom in the house. The children's own small routines of dressing and undressing, considerably simpler than their mother's, but not without their own quiet ceremony, a nanny buttoning small shoes and brushing small heads of hair with the same patient attention that Sarah gave to Mrs. Aldworth's considerably more elaborate morning. By the time the children were put to bed, somewhere around 7, well before the adult evening had properly begun, they had lived an entire small parallel version of this same day, fed and dressed and cared for by an entire structure of household labour running quietly alongside everything else, largely unremarked upon by the guests downstairs who rarely thought much, across an entire week's stay, about the small footsteps occasionally audible somewhere above their heads, or the particular quality of laughter that sometimes drifted faintly down a back staircase in the middle of an otherwise perfectly composed afternoon. Let us go back down one more time to the parts of the house that made tonight's dinner possible, because there is a room we have not properly visited yet, and it deserves a few minutes of attention before the night closes in around us completely. The wine cellar at Highclere sits below ground level, reached by a flight of stone steps from a small locked door near the butler's pantry, and it holds, in racks that stretch back into a cool darkness the electric light installed elsewhere in the house has not reached, decades of careful accumulation. Claret from good vintage years laid down not to be drunk immediately but to improve slowly over time. A patience built into the very structure of the cellar that few other parts of this fast-moving household ever demonstrated. Champagne kept at a slightly different temperature than the reds brought up specifically for occasions that called for it. Port essential to the after-dinner ritual we described earlier tonight when the men remained briefly at the table once the women had withdrawn. Sherry for the pre-dinner gathering, a whole careful architecture of taste and occasion, managed by the butler with a knowledge that took him years to acquire properly, which bottle suited which course, which vintage was approaching its peak and should be drunk soon, which was still young and should be left another few years to develop. This evening's dinner drew on perhaps 6 or 7 different selections from this same cellar, chosen days in advance in consultation with the host, brought up gradually across the afternoon so that each bottle would be at exactly the right temperature by the time it was needed, reds allowed to breathe for the appropriate interval before serving, whites kept properly cool until the last possible moment. It is its own small discipline invisible to every guest at the table tonight, who simply found a full glass in front of them at more or less the right moment throughout the evening without ever wondering how it arrived there in that condition. Back in the main kitchen, now largely quiet at this late hour except for the scullery maid finishing her endless dishes, Mrs. Nettlefold herself has already gone to bed, her own day having begun before 5 that morning and having run, with barely a pause, through breakfast, luncheon, afternoon tea, and the full elaborate architecture of tonight's dinner. A workload that would exhaust most people considerably younger than she is, sustained day after day by a combination of genuine skill, real pride in the work, and, it must be said honestly, very little alternative given the economic realities most cooks of her background faced in this particular era. She leaves behind her a kitchen that looks, even in its late-night quiet, like the aftermath of a genuinely significant undertaking, surfaces scrubbed clean, tomorrow's bread already set to prove in a warm corner near the range, a list for the morning pinned where the kitchen maid will see it first thing, everything arranged so that tomorrow's version of today can begin, once again, before the sky has properly lightened. It is worth going back briefly to something that happened quietly in the hour between afternoon tea and the start of the evening's dressing, because it closes off a small thread we picked up early this morning and never quite finished. The seating plan for tonight's dinner had in fact already been worked out 2 days earlier, penciled carefully onto a small card the hostess kept in her writing desk. Every guest's name placed according to rank and precedence in the manner we discussed a little while ago. Lady Beauchamp's original itinerary had her arriving on the 4 o'clock train, which meant, as originally planned, she would have had barely 2 hours to recover from her journey before dinner, and the seating plan had been drawn up with a certain allowance for that, her placement slightly less demanding conversationally than it might otherwise have been. A small kindness built quietly into the architecture of the evening by a hostess who understood exactly how tiring a long train journey could be. Once the telegram arrived and her arrival moved to 11 instead, the hostess spent perhaps 10 minutes that afternoon, between tea and dressing, reconsidering the plan. Lady Beauchamp would now have had the better part of a full day to rest, wash, walk, and settle in properly before dinner, considerably fresher than the original plan had accounted for, and the hostess made a small adjustment, moving her 1 seat further along the table into a slightly livelier conversational position beside a guest known for being genuinely entertaining company, a small act of social choreography that nobody at the table tonight, including Lady Beauchamp herself, would ever think to notice or question. It simply looked, like everything else this evening, as though it had always been exactly this way. This is in miniature the entire art we have spent tonight exploring. A telegram arrives, a room is prepared 5 hours ahead of schedule, a seating plan is quietly reconsidered and adjusted, a groom crosses out one time and writes in another, none of it dramatic, none of it individually even particularly difficult, but taken together across an entire day, across dozens of small decisions made by a dozen different people working from a shared, largely unspoken understanding of what this house was supposed to look like from the outside. It adds up to something genuinely remarkable, a household that could absorb a change of plans with barely a ripple and present at the end of it an evening that looked as effortless and inevitable as if it could never have unfolded any other way. There is something worth lingering on tonight in the small objects that filled this day, the physical things that carried so much of this world's particular texture, because a house like Highclere in 1911 communicated an enormous amount through objects most of us would barely notice today, and understanding them a little helps the whole day make a different kind of sense. Calling cards, small and precisely printed, sat in a silver tray in the front hall, left behind by anyone who called at the house while its occupants happened to be out, or presented formally by a footman when a visitor arrived and wished to be announced. The etiquette surrounding them was genuinely intricate, a folded corner meaning one thing, a card left in person rather than sent by post meaning another, an unanswered card sometimes carrying a coolness that no spoken words would have dared express quite so plainly. Nobody in this house needed the rules explained to them. They had absorbed them the way anyone absorbs the grammar of their own native language without ever consciously studying it. Letters, too, carried weight beyond their content. The quality of the paper, the household's own crest embossed at the top, the particular hand in which they were written, all of it communicating status and care in a way that a hurried note never could. Mrs. Aldworth's 3 pages to her sister this morning were written not simply to convey news, but to demonstrate, through the evenness of her hand and the quality of her phrasing, exactly the kind of woman she was, an unspoken performance folded into even the most private of correspondence. Clocks ticked in nearly every room of the house, small mantel clocks in the bedrooms, a larger case clock in the hall whose chime marked the hour for the entire household in a way that no other single object did, servants and family alike, in their very different corners of the house, calibrating their days against the same steady sound. Photographs sat in silver frames on dressing tables and mantels, children at younger ages, a wedding portrait, a father or grandfather in the formal dress of an earlier decade, small anchors of family history scattered through rooms that otherwise felt, in their scale and grandeur, almost impersonal. And flowers, cut fresh nearly every morning from the walled garden we visited earlier today, appeared throughout the house in a way that cost real ongoing labour and yet registered, to anyone actually living inside these rooms, as simply part of the atmosphere, the way carpet or curtains might, rather than as evidence of a gardener's continuous daily work. It is a pattern that repeats itself across nearly everything we have looked at tonight. Labour becomes atmosphere, effort becomes simply the way things are, and the house in its finished, polished, effortless appearance quietly erases almost every trace of the work that produced it, which is, when you sit with it long enough, both the great achievement of a house like this one and its great and largely unexamined cost. It is probably worth saying plainly, since so many of you likely recognise the name of this house the moment I said it earlier tonight, that Highclere Castle is real, still standing in Hampshire today, still lived in by the family that has held it for generations, and that most people's first encounter with it came through a television series that used its rooms as a filming location years ago. That show told its own particular story with its own particular characters, and I have deliberately kept us away from all of it tonight. No borrowed plot lines, no borrowed names, because the real history sitting underneath that famous roofline turns out to be just as rich, just as detailed, and in its own way just as moving as anything a screenwriter could invent. And it deserves to be told on its own terms, drawn from the actual documented life of English country houses in this particular period rather than from anything written for a camera. The house we have spent tonight inside is built from that real history, the real rhythms of fires and hot water and dinner service and dressing rooms that governed houses like this one across the whole of England in the years before the First World War changed almost everything about this way of life, permanently and often quite suddenly. 1911 sits close enough to that coming rupture that a certain wistfulness attaches itself, in hindsight, to any honest description of a day like the one we have just spent together, though nobody living inside it at the time had any way of knowing that the particular rhythm we have followed today, the fires and the footmen and the elaborate dinners, had only a handful more years left to run in anything like its full pre-war form. They simply lived it, day after day, fire after fire, dinner after dinner, the way anyone lives inside their own ordinary present, without the benefit or the burden of knowing what was coming. Night outside continues regardless of any of that, indifferent to history in the way nights always are. It is nearly 2 in the morning now, and the last of the household, the scullery maid finishing her final pot, has finally climbed the back stairs to her own narrow bed, leaving the kitchen entirely empty for the first time since before 5 o'clock the previous morning. A full stretch of nearly 21 hours during which some part of that room was in continuous, purposeful use. There is a stretch of true stillness now, between roughly 2 and 4 in the morning, that belongs to nobody at all. A rare hour in which literally every person connected to this house, family, guests, and every single member of a staff that numbered close to 30, is finally, simultaneously, asleep. It will not last. It never lasts more than a couple of hours in a house run at this scale. But for this brief window, Highclere Castle exists in a state of complete and total rest. Every fire banked low, every door closed, every clock in every room ticking on steadily toward a morning that none of the sleepers are yet awake to anticipate. If you could move silently from room to room during this particular stretch of hours, the way only a story like this one allows, you would find a house arranged in careful layers of sleep, each layer holding its own particular texture. In the principal bedrooms, the family sleeps under the heaviest, finest linens the house owns, fires still holding a little warmth from the careful banking the housekeeper performed hours earlier. The deepest, most undisturbed kind of rest that money and comfort can arrange, though sleep itself, as anyone knows, does not actually care very much how much a mattress cost. Along the guest corridor, Mrs. Aldworth and Lady Beauchamp and the rest of the house party sleep in rooms slightly less personal than the family's own, temporary comfort rather than accumulated history. Though no less warm, no less carefully prepared, each one holding its particular guest in exactly the state of unbothered rest that the entire household spent the whole of yesterday working to produce. Up under the roofline, in rooms considerably plainer, considerably colder, considerably more crowded, the servants sleep too, though their rest carries a different quality entirely, shorter, thinner, already counting down toward an alarm that most of them will feel more than hear, some internal clock built by years of early rising that wakes a housemaid at 4:30 almost without the need for anything mechanical to prompt her. Tom sleeps the deep, nearly unconscious sleep of a 15-year-old body that worked hard all day, 3 hours of rest remaining to him before the whole cycle we watched begin this morning starts itself over again, fires and ash pans and cold water on his face in the dark. And somewhere in between these layers, quite literally in the walls and passages that connect them, the house itself sits in a silence that has its own particular weight. Old stone holding the day's accumulated warmth and slowly releasing it back into the cool June night. Wood floors settling with the small ticks and creaks that old buildings make as temperatures shift. The whole structure breathing in its own slow architectural way, the way it has breathed every single night for generations before this one and would continue breathing for generations after it, largely indifferent to which particular family, which particular guests, which particular servants happen to be sleeping inside it on any given night. It might be worth spending a few final quiet minutes tonight on the rules that governed a servant's private life in a house like this one, because they shaped these late-night hours in ways worth understanding before we let the whole household finally rest completely. A housemaid or a footman working at Highclere in 1911 did not simply work here. In a very real sense, they lived here, their entire existence contained within the walls of a single household for the majority of the year, with time away limited to an annual holiday and occasional days off that had to be requested and approved well in advance. Followers, meaning romantic visitors or suitors, were strictly regulated in most houses of this standing, sometimes forbidden outright for female staff, sometimes permitted only under specific conditions and specific hours, a rule that sounds intrusive to modern ears and was, by any honest account, exactly that, though it reflected the genuine anxieties of employers who felt directly responsible, in a way few employers today would recognize, for the moral conduct of the young people living under their roof. Letters home were written on whatever evenings a servant could find a spare half hour, often by candlelight in a shared attic room after a full day's labour, news of a wage, a promotion, a difficult mistress or a kind one, sent back to families sometimes many counties away who depended, in some cases, on the money a daughter or son in service was able to send home each quarter. Service was not simply a job in this era. For many working-class families, it was a genuine economic strategy, a way of placing a child somewhere with guaranteed food, guaranteed shelter, and a wage that could be partly saved or partly sent home, however modest that wage actually was against the hours it demanded. And yet within these real constraints, a genuine social life still existed below stairs. Friendships formed over shared work and shared meals in the servants' hall. A housemaid and a footman who might, within the rules or occasionally just outside them, develop an understanding that would eventually lead to marriage and often to both of them leaving service for a small business or a cottage of their own. The beginning of an entirely different kind of life built, in some small part, on savings accumulated during years of exactly the labour we have spent tonight describing. Not every story below stairs was one of quiet endurance. Some were genuinely, quietly happy, built from the particular closeness that comes from working alongside the same small group of people day after day for years, inside walls that the rest of the world never really saw. A little after 3, a light rain begins outside, the kind of soft, unhurried English rain that barely announces itself. No thunder, no sudden downpour, just a gradual dampening of the lawn and the gravel drive and the leaves of the cedar trees that have stood watch over this house for so many decades. It taps gently against window panes throughout the sleeping house, a sound so faint and so steady that it barely registers as sound at all to anyone deep enough in sleep. More a texture added to the night than an interruption of it. Mrs. Aldworth stirs slightly at some point during this stretch, shifts beneath her blankets, and settles again without ever properly waking. The rain absorbed seamlessly into whatever she happened to be dreaming. This particular rhythm of a June night in Hampshire, warm enough that the fires burning low in a dozen bedroom grates are more comfort than necessity, cool enough that nobody sleeping tonight has thrown back their blankets entirely, sits at a particular point in the estate's much longer yearly calendar too, a calendar this house and the family running it had followed for generations, shaping not just today but the whole rhythm of the year around it. Summer at Highclere meant house parties much like the one we have spent tonight inside, guests arriving for stretches of days or weeks, the London season having recently concluded or about to begin, depending on exactly which weeks of summer we are standing in. Autumn would bring shooting parties, an entirely different kind of hospitality organised around the estate's own game, gentlemen out across the parkland with guns rather than horses, an entirely different set of preparations occupying the household's attention. Winter drew the family closer inward, fewer guests, longer evenings by larger fires, a Christmas that would have filled these same rooms with an entirely different kind of activity and decoration than anything we have watched happen today. Each season carried its own particular demands on the household, its own particular rhythm of preparation and labour, and yet underneath all of that seasonal variation sat the same essential structure we have followed for this entire day: fires built before dawn, water carried up narrow stairs, meals produced in a kitchen most guests would never think to visit, clothing brushed and pressed by hands nobody upstairs could reliably name. The season changed the specific tasks, it never changed the underlying machine. By 4 in the morning, the rain has settled into a steady, gentle patter, and somewhere up under the roofline, in a small room she shares with another housemaid, one particular servant stirs not from any alarm, but from the same internal clock that has woken her at roughly this hour for the better part of 3 years now. She lies still for a moment in the darkness, listening to the rain against the small window above her bed, feeling the particular ache in her shoulders that a full day's work leaves behind. And then, because there is genuinely no alternative and because this is simply what the day requires of her, she gets up, dresses quietly in the dark so as not to wake her roommate a full 20 minutes before she needs to, and begins once again the long walk down 4 flights of worn stone stairs toward a kitchen where a fire, however carefully banked, will need building back up into something the whole house can properly wake to. Before we settle into the last stretch of this night together, let us walk once more briefly through everything this single day actually held, because it is only once you can see the whole shape of it at once that the true scale of what this house accomplished today becomes fully clear. In the hour before 5, a fire was already being coaxed back to life in a cold stone passage while the house above slept on, convinced of its own perfect stillness. By 5:30, 3 housemaids were moving silently through a dozen bedrooms, building fires and opening curtains for people who would never know they had been there at all. By 6, hot water was already climbing 4 flights of narrow back stairs in brass cans, carried by arms that would repeat that same climb a dozen more times before the day was through. By 7, a cook was standing at a table the length of a small boat, holding an entire day's meals in her head with the precision of a conductor holding an orchestra's full score. By 7:30, a woman was waking in a warm room with no idea that 90 minutes of invisible labor had already gone into making that warmth simply appear to be a property of the room itself. By 9, a telegram had arrived that quietly reorganized 5 hours of somebody else's careful planning, and nobody above stairs would ever know it had happened at all. By 11, a guest stepped off a train and into a bedroom that felt to her as though it had been waiting patiently for days, built in truth in a matter of hours by 2 housemaids working at genuine speed against a deadline nobody told her existed. By 1, an entirely ordinary lunch was unfolding around a table of people discussing horses and gossip, resting on a kitchen's quiet precision that none of them thought to notice. By 4, a tea tray that took 2 hours to prepare was consumed in 40 unhurried minutes, and nobody at that table considered even briefly where the scones had come from or whose hands had iced the small cakes arranged so carefully on the stand in front of them. Come 6, an entire second architecture of labour began rebuilding itself upstairs. Women transformed room by room from afternoon walkers into evenings fully jewelled, fully composed versions of themselves, each transformation requiring another woman's steady, practiced hands. By 8, a dinner of 6 or more courses began arriving at precisely calculated intervals from a kitchen that had been building toward this exact hour since before dawn, carried by footmen who had rehearsed this same choreography hundreds of times before tonight. By 11, the whole visible performance of the day was finally winding down, guests drifting up to bed in 2s and 3s, entirely unaware that an entirely separate day, just as long and just as demanding, was only now reaching its final hours below and behind them. That is the shape of it. 20 hours of continuous, coordinated, almost entirely invisible labour performed by 25 or 30 people, in service of producing something that looked from where the family and their guests sat like nothing more than a pleasant, unhurried day in a beautiful old house. Not a single hour of it accidental, not a single hour of it particularly acknowledged by anyone as the achievement it genuinely was. Tomorrow this same house will do almost exactly the same thing again, with only the smallest variations. The house party is expected to stay another 4 days at least, possibly longer if the weather holds and nobody's plans change unexpectedly, which means Tom will build the same fires, the housemaids will climb the same stairs, Mrs. Nettlefold will plan another day's worth of meals around whatever the walled garden and the local suppliers can provide. There is already, in fact, a rough plan for tomorrow taking shape in several different minds across the house even as everyone else sleeps. The housekeeper's small book already holds a note about a possible picnic lunch out on the grounds if the rain clears by midday, which would mean an entirely different set of preparations than today's indoor luncheon. Hampers packed, rugs and cushions carried out to a chosen spot beneath the cedar trees. An entire additional layer of coordination folded quietly into what will, to the guests enjoying it, simply look like a spontaneous and delightful idea that occurred to somebody over breakfast. Mrs. Nettlefold has already decided, before going to bed tonight, that tomorrow's dinner will feature a saddle of mutton if the butcher's delivery arrives as expected, and has made a small note to herself about a particular sauce she wants to try, an idea that came to her somewhere in the middle of today's much busier service, filed away for tomorrow the way a musician might jot down a phrase that occurred to them mid-performance, to be properly worked out later when there is time. There is always, it turns out, a next day already partly forming inside a house like this one, even as the current day has not yet fully finished closing itself down. And there is something worth sitting with in these final quiet hours, about the sheer physical cost of a day like the one we have just spent together, a cost that fell so unevenly across the different people who shared this same 24 hours under the same roof. Mrs. Aldworth's day, full as it was with washing and dressing and walking and dining, was fundamentally a day of leisure, however elaborately structured that leisure happened to be, and she will wake tomorrow rested, her body having done nothing more demanding than an afternoon's walk and the ordinary business of moving gracefully through a series of beautifully appointed rooms. The housemaid who woke at 4:30 this morning and who woke again, briefly, at 4 this same night before falling back into a last thin hour of sleep, will feel this day in her shoulders and in her feet for the whole of tomorrow, and the day after that will simply be another version of today, and the day after that another version still, a rhythm that will continue, with only the smallest variations, for as many years as her position and her health allow her to keep it going. Neither version of this day is a lie exactly. Both are simply true, occupying the very same hours inside the very same house, experienced by people who passed each other constantly today on staircases and in corridors, and who understood almost nothing in any real detail about what the other one's day had actually cost them. It is worth returning one final time tonight to that contrast between the magnificent and the hidden, because it sits at the very centre of everything we have walked through together today, and because a house like Highclere makes that contrast physically visible in a way few other buildings from any era quite manage. Stand in the saloon, beneath its high painted ceiling, surrounded by portraits and gilt and the accumulated grandeur of centuries, and you are standing in a room built entirely to be seen, to communicate wealth and taste and lineage to anyone who walks through it, a room with no functional purpose beyond the purely social and symbolic. Walk 20 feet in almost any direction from that same room, through a door built to look like part of the wall, down a narrow flight of stairs lit by a single small window, and you arrive somewhere that no architect ever intended a guest to see. Plain plastered walls, bare wooden treads worn soft by decades of hurrying feet, the whole aesthetic sensibility of the grand rooms above simply absent, because nobody who mattered, by the logic of this house's design, was ever meant to look at it. This was not accidental. It was in fact one of the great architectural preoccupations of great houses across this entire era, the deliberate design of two parallel buildings occupying the very same physical footprint, one visible and beautiful, one hidden and purely functional, connected by doors and passages engineered specifically to keep the two worlds from ever accidentally colliding. A guest at Highclere could in principle stay an entire week and never once glimpse the back stairs, never once see the kitchen, never once encounter a servant who was not, at that exact moment, actively and visibly performing a specific task in a specific location where servants were expected to be seen. The rest of the time, an entire population roughly the size of a small village moved through this same building along routes designed to make them essentially invisible, a genuine architectural achievement that most guests then and now would walk straight past without ever registering it as an achievement at all. And perhaps that is the truest way to understand this house and houses like it at this particular moment in history. Not simply as a home, though it was that, genuinely for the family who lived within its grandest rooms. Not simply as a workplace, though it was that too, for the 30 or so people who spent their working lives moving through its hidden half, but as a kind of enormous, continuously operating machine for the production of a very specific and very carefully maintained illusion, the illusion that comfort, beauty, and ease simply exist, naturally and without cost, in certain places and for certain people, when in fact every single hour of that comfort was built quietly and skillfully by somebody else's hands. There is one small room in this house we have not yet visited tonight, tucked near the housekeeper's own quarters, low-ceilinged and smelling faintly of sugar and dried herbs even at this late hour, that deserves a few minutes before we let the whole story finally rest. The still room, as it was called, sat somewhere between kitchen and pharmacy, a space where the housekeeper or a servant working under her direct supervision produced the jams and preserves that appeared on the breakfast table this morning, alongside a whole quiet tradition of household remedies that predated, in most great houses, any regular reliance on a doctor for minor complaints. Jams made from soft fruit grown in the walled garden filled shelf after shelf here, put up in late summer when the fruit was at its best and stored to last through the winter months when nothing fresh grew anywhere nearby. Cordials, herbal preparations meant to settle a stomach or ease a headache, mixtures passed down through generations of housekeepers, each adding or adjusting according to their own accumulated experience. Half genuine herbal knowledge and half something closer to folk tradition, the line between the two considerably blurrier in 1911 than it would become even a decade or two later. A mild case of indigestion after a rich dinner, a headache brought on by too much sun during an afternoon walk, a child's minor cough in the nursery upstairs. All of these might be treated first from the still room's own small stock before anyone considered sending a groom for the doctor in the village, whose visit represented both real expense and, in a household this size, a small admission that something had gone genuinely wrong rather than merely inconveniently. The still room, in other words, was where this house quietly managed the smaller physical discomforts of daily life long before they became serious enough to require outside help. Another entire small department of expertise tucked into the household structure, run almost entirely by women, almost entirely unremarked upon by anyone above stairs unless they happened, on some particular morning, to actually need what it produced. There is a custom worth mentioning too, before we finally let this day close, because it says something particular about how the household's labour and the family's gratitude for that labour were formally, if imperfectly, connected. When a guest like Lady Beauchamp eventually departs, at the end of her stay it was customary for her to leave a small sum of money, a veil, distributed among the servants who had attended her most directly during her visit, her own maid excepted since that maid worked for her already, but the housemaid who attended her fire each morning, the footman who had carried her trunks up on arrival, would each receive a small token of thanks, discreetly, usually handed over on the morning of departure rather than announced or acknowledged in any more public way. It was not a large sum, and it was not by any means a substitute for proper wages, but it represented one of the very few moments in this entire elaborate system where a guest's gratitude for labour she had, technically, never seen, translated into something direct and tangible passing from her own hand into the hand of the person who had actually performed it. It is worth spending a final moment tonight thinking about where a life like Tom's, the hall boy who built the very first fire of this whole long day, might actually lead. Because service in a house like this one was rarely, for a boy with any ambition and any luck, a single fixed destination. He is 15 now, in his second year at Highclere, having come to the house through a connection his mother had with a housemaid already in service here, the kind of quiet, informal network through which most great house staff were actually recruited in this era, personal recommendation mattering considerably more than any formal application. If he continues steadily and if his conduct remains good and his work reliable, he might expect within 3 or 4 years to be promoted to under footman, a genuine step up in both status and wages, trading the hall boy's grimy, unglamorous tasks for the more visible, more skilled work of serving at table and answering the front door. From there, if he shows real aptitude, particularly the kind of calm, unflappable competence the butler prizes above almost any other quality, he might in time become a full footman, and eventually, after many years of accumulated experience and a good deal of patience, might realistically aspire to become a butler himself in this house, or more likely in some other great house willing to take on an experienced, well-trained man in his 30s or 40s to run their own household. It was not a fast path, and it was not a guaranteed one, but it was real, a genuine ladder that a capable young man could climb entirely within the world of domestic service, ending for the fortunate and the skilled in a position of real authority and real respect, however different in kind from the authority the family upstairs held by simple accident of birth. Tom does not think about any of this at 4:30 in the morning, kneeling in front of a cold grate with his hands already dirty from ash and kindling. If he thinks about anything at all beyond the immediate task in front of him, about breakfast, still some hours away, and about whether the flue in this particular grate is going to give him trouble again the way it did earlier in the week. The larger shape of his own life, the ladder stretching out ahead of him across years he has not yet lived, is not something a 15-year-old boy building a fire before dawn has much occasion to reflect on. That kind of reflection, if it comes at all, tends to arrive much later, usually somewhere around the age Mrs. Ferris has now reached, looking back across 4 decades of exactly this kind of work and finding, somewhat to her own surprise, that it added up to something resembling a genuine life. Beyond the house and its immediate grounds, Highclere in 1911 sat at the centre of a small local world that extended well past the family and the guests we have followed today, a relationship between great house and surrounding village that shaped much of the wider community's daily rhythm too, in ways worth a brief mention before we close this story out properly. The estate employed, directly or indirectly, a significant portion of the local population. Not just the 30 or so indoor servants we have spent tonight with, but gardeners, gamekeepers, groundsmen, and estate workers living in cottages scattered across the property, along with the tenant farmers whose rents the land agent discussed with the Earl this same morning. The village church, a short distance from the house itself, held a pew reserved specifically for the family, a small but genuinely significant marker of the household's standing within a community structure that still, in 1911, organised much of its social life around the parish. Village fetes and local celebrations often received support, financial or otherwise, from the house, a relationship of patronage that carried real obligations in both directions. The estate expected to provide a certain baseline of stability and support. The village expected to supply in turn much of the labour that kept the great house itself running. It is easy, spending as much time as we have tonight inside the walls of the house itself, to lose sight of just how much this single building sat at the centre of an entire local economy, an entire small society organised in ways both formal and informal around its needs and its patronage. The house we have walked through tonight was never really separate from the community surrounding it, however much its grand rooms and its careful hierarchy might have suggested a world entirely unto itself. It was, in its own particular 1911 fashion, simply the largest and most visible node in a whole web of relationships extending out across the Hampshire countryside, most of which nobody sitting at tonight's dinner table gave much conscious thought to at all. Let us come back, now one final time, to where the guests themselves are sleeping, because there is a particular tenderness in how carefully this house tailored even something as simple as a pillow to the particular person resting on it, and it is worth lingering there for a moment before we let the whole story finally close. Sarah knew, from years of small accumulated observations, that Mrs. Aldworth preferred a firmer pillow than most, disliked the softest goose down the linen cupboard could offer, and had quietly requested, on the first night of this particular stay, a slightly different arrangement than the standard the housekeeper would otherwise have provided. Lady Beauchamp's own maid had made a similar small adjustment for her mistress, an extra blanket folded at the foot of the bed because Lady Beauchamp, she knew from long experience, ran cold in the small hours regardless of what the actual temperature of a room happened to be. These are the kind of details that never appear in any history of a house like this one, too small, too personal, too far beneath the notice of anyone writing about grand architecture or grand families, and yet they represent in their own quiet way some of the most genuine care this entire elaborate system produced. One woman noticing, over years of close attention, exactly what another woman needed to sleep comfortably and simply providing it night after night without ever making a particular point of having done so. It is nearly 4 in the morning now, and the rain outside has softened further still, barely more than a mist against the windows, the kind of gentle English weather that seems to exist specifically to be slept through rather than noticed. Dinner is long over. The last of the wine has been cleared from the cellar's careful selection and the empty bottles counted alongside the silver. Lady Beauchamp, who arrived on a train she was not originally meant to be on, who found a bedroom she had no idea did not exist in its current state 5 hours before her arrival, sleeps now behind a closed door in the blue room, entirely unaware of anything but the simple, seamless comfort the house presented to her from the moment she stepped off that early train. The silver has been counted, every piece accounted for and locked away in the butler's own secure cupboard. The china has been washed, dried, and returned to its shelves by hands that worked well past midnight to make sure of it. The evening's clothing, gowns, and coats and gloves has been brushed and hung and, where needed, set aside for small morning repairs, ready to be worn again exactly as though it had never left its wardrobe at all. Jewellery sits back in its cases on dressing tables throughout the guest corridor. Diamonds and garnets and paste stones alike return to darkness until tomorrow evening calls them out again. Fires have been lowered in every occupied room, banked carefully rather than extinguished, holding just enough warmth to see each sleeper through until morning without wasting fuel on flame nobody is awake to appreciate. Curtains are drawn fully closed against the soft rain outside. Every bedroom door in the house, family and guest alike, stands shut, each one holding its own small pocket of warmth and rest, entirely separate from every other and entirely, completely quiet. One last figure moves through the house at this hour, later even than the scullery maid who finally climbed to bed a little while ago, later than the housekeeper's own careful rounds. It is the butler, making a final check before he too allows himself to sleep, a small oil lamp held low in one hand, moving through the ground floor rooms one final time with the unhurried thoroughness of a man who has performed this exact walk, in this exact order, for years. He passes through the entrance hall first, checking the great front doors are properly bolted, the small single lamp left burning there casting long shadows up the grand staircase that only a few hours ago carried a whole procession of guests dressed in silk and evening jewels toward a dinner that has now been entirely cleared, counted, and put away. He crosses into the saloon, dark and vast and silent, the portraits along its walls barely visible in the low light of his lamp. Generations of faces looking down on a room that holds, at this hour, nothing but stillness and the faint smell of a fire that burned there hours ago and has now gone almost entirely cold. He checks the library next. The fire there banked properly, the books settled on their shelves exactly as they were left, the deep chair by the window empty and waiting for whoever might want it again tomorrow. The butler does not linger long in any of these rooms, though he moves through each one slowly enough that a person watching might mistake it briefly for lingering. There is nothing particularly to do in them at this hour beyond confirming that everything is exactly as it should be, and yet there is something in the quality of his walk through them, unhurried, methodical, almost tender in its thoroughness, that suggests a man who has come, after years in this position, to feel something close to genuine responsibility for this house, not merely as an employer's property, but as a structure he has helped, night after night, to properly close down and protect through the dark hours when nobody else is watching over it at all. He passes finally through the door that separates the family's grand rooms from the working half of the house we have spent so much of tonight inside. Down the narrow back stairs, past the kitchen where the range still holds its low overnight warmth, through the servants' hall where the last embers of a much smaller fire glow faintly in a grate considerably plainer than anything upstairs. He extinguishes his lamp near the foot of the stairs leading up to his own room, and climbs them in a near total darkness he has walked so many times he barely needs to see at all. And somewhere behind him, the whole magnificent, silent, sleeping half of the house he has just walked through stands entirely empty, waiting the way it waits every single night of the year, for a morning that is still, for a few more hours, comfortably far away. Outside now, the rain has stopped almost entirely. just the faintest occasional drop falling from the cedar trees where water has gathered in the branches through the night. The lawn lies dark and wet and silent under a sky that has not yet begun to show any real sign of the dawn still several hours away. Highclere Castle stands against that dark sky exactly as it stood at the very start of this story, every window dark now except for nothing at all, not even the single lamp the butler left burning earlier, because he has extinguished that too on his final round, leaving the house in a completeness of darkness that matches, from the outside, the complete stillness anyone standing on this same lawn would have assumed was true from the very beginning. Even the gravel of the long drive lies undisturbed now. No carriage wheels, no motor car tyres, nothing but the faint marks left earlier today by a groom's boots hurrying toward the stable yard with news of a change of plans that mattered, for a few busy hours, more than almost anything else in the house. And that means nothing at all now, in this final hushed stretch before morning, to anyone but the two housemaids who quietly solved it. A person walking past on the road below the house at this hour, if anyone were foolish or purposeful enough to be walking a country road in Hampshire at 4 in the morning, cold and slightly damp from the rain that has only just stopped falling, breath faintly visible even in June's mild night air, would see nothing to suggest that this building held, only a few hours earlier, a full formal dinner of 8 courses, a house party of guests in silk and evening jewels, a kitchen staff of 6 working at genuine speed through a heat that built steadily across an entire evening, the butler counting silver with the seriousness of a man auditing a bank vault, a housekeeper reorganizing 5 hours of preparation because of a single telegram, and 30 separate people, each performing their own particular skilled version of an enormously complicated daily labor, all of it converging somehow into an evening that looked, to anyone actually living inside it, like the simplest and most natural thing in the world. That person walking the road would simply see a large dark house, asleep, the way houses are supposed to look at 4 in the morning, and they would be, in the most literal sense, entirely correct. The house is asleep, every single person inside it, family, guest, and servant alike, has finally, at this late hour, found their way into rest, each one carrying into sleep their own particular version of this same long day, a day that looked, depending entirely on which door you happened to be standing behind, like effortless leisure or like exhausting, skillful, unacknowledged labor, and was, in the honest fullness of it, somehow both of these things at once, inseparable from each other, each one depending entirely on the other's continued invisible existence. Not every hour of today went entirely to plan, and it is worth mentioning the one small hiccup that did occur, because it shows this same quiet system of care operating under genuine, if minor, pressure rather than simply gliding along a perfectly smooth track. Sometime around midday, one of the housemaids noticed that the fire laid that morning in a guest bedroom 2 doors down from Mrs. Aldworth's had begun sending faint traces of smoke back into the room rather than properly drawing up the chimney. A problem that happens occasionally in old houses when a bird's nest or a fall of soot partially blocks a flue that has otherwise worked perfectly well for years. She reported it immediately to the housekeeper rather than attempting to manage it herself, and within 20 minutes a chimney sweep's boy, kept on informal retainer by the estate for exactly this kind of occasional need, had been sent for from the village, arriving within the hour to clear whatever obstruction had formed. The guest occupying that room, a cousin of the family staying for a shorter visit than Lady Beauchamp's, had been out walking the grounds during the entire small drama and returned, sometime in the early afternoon, to a room that showed no trace whatsoever of the problem, fire laid fresh again for the evening, windows that had been briefly opened to clear the smoke now closed against the June air, everything restored so completely that she would have had no way of knowing, unless someone specifically told her, that anything had gone wrong at all. This is, in its own small way, the truest possible demonstration of everything we have spent tonight exploring. A genuine problem arose. It was noticed immediately, reported through the correct channel, solved efficiently by people equipped to solve it, and erased so thoroughly from the visible record of the day that its only trace by evening existed purely in the housekeeper's small notebook, a single line noting the chimney sweep's visit and the modest sum owed for it, filed away alongside 100 other small entries documenting 100 other small problems solved across 100 other similarly ordinary days. It is tempting, hearing a story like this one, to imagine that a house like Highclere in 1911 ran with some kind of impossible superhuman perfection, and that temptation is worth resisting gently before we let this whole long day finally close. Things went wrong here regularly in exactly the way things go wrong in any household of any size in any era. A smoking chimney, a delayed delivery, a guest's changed plans, a dress that needed mending before it could be worn again. The genuine skill of a house like this one was never the absence of problems. It was the speed and the quiet confidence with which those problems were absorbed, solved, and folded back into an appearance of total effortlessness before anyone who mattered, by the logic of this particular world, ever had occasion to notice they had happened at all. There is one final distinction worth drawing before we let the house settle fully into its last hours of darkness, and it is the distinction between the guests passing through these rooms this week and the family who will still be here in exactly this same house, long after Lady Beauchamp and Mrs. Aldworth and the rest of this particular house party have packed their trunks and returned to their own separate lives scattered across the country. For a guest, however genuinely warm the welcome, however carefully every small comfort has been arranged, a stay at Highclere remains, in the end, a temporary and slightly heightened experience, a beautifully constructed pocket of ease existing outside the ordinary rhythm of her own daily life, to be enjoyed fully and then, eventually, left behind. For the family themselves, this same house is simply where they live, has been where generations of them have lived, will presumably continue to be where their own children and grandchildren live long after this particular June has faded into an unremarkable memory among many similar ones. The Countess, sleeping in her own bedroom tonight, is not experiencing anything like the pleasant, slightly novel comfort Lady Beauchamp felt settling into the Blue Room. She is simply home, in a bed she has slept in for decades, surrounded by objects and arrangements that reflect her own accumulated life rather than a temporary, if genuinely thoughtful, hospitality extended to a visitor. This distinction matters, in a quiet way, to understanding everything we have watched happen today. The whole elaborate machinery of the household, the fires and the meals and the endless careful choreography of comfort, exists in service of two rather different things at once. The ongoing, permanent, rooted life of a family that has occupied this particular house for generations, and the temporary, carefully curated experience of guests who move through it for a week or two before returning to lives of their own elsewhere, under different roofs, tended by different staffs performing their own versions of this exact same daily labour. Both experiences are real, both matter in their own way to the people living them. And underneath both of them runs the very same current we have followed for this entire long day, a household of skilled, largely unacknowledged people, working from before dawn until well past midnight, to make an extraordinary amount of daily human effort disappear entirely into something that looks from any angle a guest or a family member might reasonably occupy, like nothing more than an ordinary, beautiful, unremarkable day in a very old and very well-run English house. There is a small sewing box that belongs to Sarah, kept in a drawer of the dressing table she uses in the room off Mrs. Aldworth's own, and it holds in its own modest way another entire small thread of hidden labour worth mentioning before we let this house finally close its eyes completely. A lady's maid in a house like this one is expected to be a genuinely skilled needlewoman, and not in the ornamental sense of embroidery worked for pleasure on a quiet afternoon, though many of them did that too, but in the entirely practical sense of keeping an employer's entire wardrobe in a constant state of readiness, a torn hem mended before it could be noticed, a loose button replaced before it fell off entirely, a seam let out or taken in as a dress needed adjusting to fit a body that, like any body, shifted subtly over months and years. Tonight, before she finally went to bed herself, Sarah noticed a small tear along the hem of the walking dress Mrs. Aldworth wore this afternoon, caught most likely on a bramble somewhere along the path near the parkland, and rather than mentioning it and risking her mistress's mild irritation at a favourite dress being even briefly out of commission, she simply sat for 20 minutes by candlelight in her own small room, needle and thread moving in small, even stitches invisible to anyone who did not already know exactly where to look, and mended it completely before hanging it back in the wardrobe as though nothing had ever happened to it at all. This is such a small thing, 20 minutes of quiet needlework at the end of an already long day, and yet it represents in miniature the entire logic of everything we have spent tonight exploring. A small problem arose. It was noticed, addressed, and erased so completely from the visible record that its only trace exists now in Sarah's own tired hands and in a length of thread that matches the dress so precisely it would take a genuinely careful eye in full daylight to find the mend at all. Out past the walled kitchen garden, in the long glass houses where grapes and peaches ripen months ahead of their natural season, the head gardener makes his own final check of the day, considerably later than most of the household's other senior figures, because glass houses in this era required a particular kind of nightly attention that few other parts of the estate demanded. He checks that the small stoves used to heat the glass houses through cooler nights are drawing properly, adjusts a vent here and there to manage the humidity that citrus and stone fruit required to thrive so far outside their natural climate, and walks slowly down the long rows of trained trees, their branches spread flat and secured against the warm brick walls in the particular technique that let a Hampshire garden produce fruit that would in any ordinary outdoor setting this far north have had no reasonable chance of ripening at all. He has held this position for 11 years, has trained under 2 different head gardeners before him going back decades further still, part of a horticultural tradition every bit as skilled and every bit as demanding as anything happening inside the house proper, though almost nobody at tonight's dinner table paused over the fruit course to consider how many years of accumulated knowledge and how many hours of careful nightly attention had gone into the peaches sitting quietly on the sideboard behind them. He locks the glass house door behind him, checks the walled garden's outer gate is properly secured against deer that occasionally found their way in from the parkland beyond, and walks back toward his own cottage at the edge of the estate, one of a scattered handful of homes belonging to senior estate staff who lived not in the house itself but close enough to reach it quickly, their own small domestic lives running in a rhythm just slightly separate from, and yet completely bound up with, everything we have followed inside these walls tonight. There is, if you think about it for even a moment, an entire second estate's worth of quiet expertise like this scattered across Highclere's grounds at this very hour, grooms asleep above stables that will need them again in a few short hours, gamekeepers whose work we have barely touched on tonight, gardeners whose glass houses and walled beds supplied nearly everything fresh that appeared on today's table, each one holding their own small, specific, hard-won skill, each one as invisible to tonight's dinner conversation as the housemaid who built this morning's fires or the scullery maid who only just finished washing tonight's final dish. Down past the stables, in a small cottage of his own at the edge of a coppice that borders the parkland, the estate's gamekeeper makes his own final round of the night, a lantern swinging low in one hand, checking on pheasant pens that will matter far more come autumn than they do in the quiet green heart of June. His work runs almost entirely opposite to the household's own daily rhythm, quietest in summer, when the birds are simply growing and the woods need only routine tending, busiest in the cold months ahead, when shooting parties considerably larger and considerably louder than tonight's quiet dinner will fill these same grounds with an entirely different kind of activity, guns and dogs, and a whole separate machinery of hospitality built around a single day's sport. Tonight, though, his rounds are simple. He checks that the pens are secure against foxes, the same foxes that cross the lawn near the house at this same hour, indifferent to any of the boundaries humans draw around their own particular interests. He notes in his own small book kept for exactly this purpose, a hedge that needs repair before the young birds grow bold enough to wander through the gap in it, and makes a note to mention it to one of the estate's outdoor labourers in the morning. He is in his own quiet corner of this vast operation, running a business every bit as specific and every bit as skilled as anything happening inside the house itself. An entire year's calendar of breeding, feeding and protecting birds that exist for a single purpose still months away, and he does it largely alone, in cottages and coppices well outside the boundary most guests would ever think to walk. Closer to the house, in the stable yard, the head groom makes his own last check of the horses before finally allowing himself to sleep, moving quietly from stall to stall with a lantern of his own, checking water, checking that each animal stands comfortably, resting a hand briefly against the neck of the mare that carried Mrs. Aldworth's husband on this afternoon's ride, more from habit and genuine affection than from any real necessity. He has worked with horses his entire life in this same stable yard for nearly 20 years now, and there is a particular ease in how he moves among these animals that no amount of training with the newer motor car parked at the far end of the yard has managed to replace in him, though he tolerates the machine well enough and has even, on occasion, allowed the young chauffeur to explain some small piece of its workings to him with more patience than either man probably expected of the other. He checks the tack room last, making sure everything hangs properly, leather kept supple and ready for tomorrow's use, and only then does he cross the yard to his own small room above the stables, close enough to hear if any animal grows genuinely distressed in the night, far enough to have, like so many of the senior staff we have met tonight, a small private space that belongs, in whatever limited sense his position allowed, entirely to him. Back inside the house itself, in nearly every occupied bedroom, one final small comfort has already been arranged hours ago and now sits quietly doing its work beneath heavy blankets throughout the guest corridor and the family's own rooms alike. A stone hot water bottle, or in some of the grander bedrooms, a proper brass warming pan filled with embers and run briefly between the sheets before the fire was banked for the night, had already done its work of taking the deepest chill off each bed before its occupant ever climbed into it, a small ordinary kindness performed by a housemaid hours before anyone thought to ask for it, cooling now slowly beneath each sleeper, still holding just enough warmth to matter through these final coldest hours before dawn. The Earl himself we have not properly followed into his own bedroom tonight, and it is worth a few final minutes before we let this whole household finally close its eyes. His own evening ritual, considerably shorter than his wife's or any of the women staying in the house this week, followed its own quieter version of everything we have watched happen elsewhere tonight. His valet helped him out of his evening tailcoat and studs, laid tomorrow's riding clothes ready for an early morning he intends to spend out on the estate before the day's social obligations properly begin, and left him eventually alone in a room that has been his for the whole of his adult life. Its particular arrangement of furniture and books and a worn leather chair by the window reflecting decades of his own accumulated habits, rather than anything a housekeeper's careful preparation could ever fully replicate for a guest. He does not read poetry the way Mrs. Aldworth did 2 doors away. He reads for perhaps 20 minutes before sleep finds him, a report from his land agent concerning next year's planting rotation on 2 of the estate's larger tenant farms, the kind of dry, practical reading that most people would find a poor companion for the final minutes before sleep, and that he finds after a day spent largely in company and conversation, genuinely restful precisely because it asks so little of him emotionally and so much of him practically. A different kind of mind entirely from the one dinner conversation required of him a few hours earlier. He sets it aside eventually, turns down the lamp and lies for a few minutes in the particular darkness of a room he could walk blindfolded, listening to the same faint rain that has been falling gently across the whole of the house and grounds for the better part of an hour now, and is asleep himself within a few minutes, his own version of today's long list of small decisions and small responsibilities finally briefly set down. There is something worth noticing in how differently sleep arrives for each person we have followed tonight, and yet how completely, in the end, it claims every single one of them regardless of the particular shape their day took to reach it. Mrs. Aldworth drifted off over 2 poems she barely finished reading. Lady Beauchamp settled into a bed that had not existed in its current ready state 12 hours earlier. The Earl closed a report on crop rotation and let the day's accumulated weight simply release itself into an ordinary, undramatic sleep. Tom fell asleep the moment his head found his thin pillow, too tired for reading of any kind, his body simply switching itself off the way exhausted young bodies do. Mrs. Ferris closed her small notebook and climbed to a room that represented, after 4 decades of service, the nearest thing to genuinely private space her whole working life had afforded her. Every single one of these sleepers arrived at the very same destination by a completely different road, and every single one of them will wake tomorrow to a version of this same house that looks on the surface almost exactly like the one they fell asleep inside tonight, however different their own particular waking hour and their own particular first task of the day happens to be. That, perhaps, is the last quiet truth worth carrying out of this house with you tonight, before its own long night finally closes over everyone sleeping inside it. A house like Highclere held, on any given ordinary day in 1911, an entire small world of very different lives running alongside one another, overlapping constantly in corridors and doorways and shared meals, and yet remaining, in the deepest and most daily sense, almost entirely separate, each person carrying their own particular version of comfort or labor, ease or exhaustion, privilege or duty, through hours that looked, from any single vantage point inside the house, like simply an ordinary day. Multiply that single day by the thousands upon thousands of days a house like this one actually stood, generation after generation, family after family, servant after servant, and you begin to understand something of what a place like Highclere Castle really is, underneath the postcard image and the golden stone and the famous name. Not simply a beautiful old building, a machine built entirely from human hands and human hours, running so quietly and so continuously that its own occupants rarely paused, across their whole lives inside it, to notice it running at all. One further small thing is worth mentioning before we finally let the house sleep completely, because it touches something we noticed right at the very start of tonight's story and deserves to be closed properly rather than simply left hanging in the dark. The Blue Room, prepared in less than 5 hours after a telegram nobody above stairs ever knew existed, now holds Lady Beauchamp in exactly the same deep, undisturbed sleep as every other guest along this same corridor, her breathing slow and even, one hand resting loosely on the blanket the way a person sleeps when nothing at all is troubling them. She will wake tomorrow in a room she already thinks of, after less than a full day, as simply hers for the length of her stay, warm and familiar and entirely without any memory of the version of it that existed only this morning. Dust sheets and empty grates and no flowers at all on a dressing table that now in the darkness holds a small vase of roses cut from a garden she has not yet properly seen. That quiet transformation, dust sheets to fresh flowers in under 5 hours, performed by 2 housemaids working at a pace nobody above stairs will ever fully appreciate, is perhaps as good a place as any to leave this particular thread of tonight's story. Not because it resolved dramatically, but because it did not need to. It simply happened quietly, competently, exactly the way 100 other small crises were absorbed and erased across this same long day, and by morning it will have become simply another unremarkable fact of Lady Beauchamp's stay, indistinguishable to her from every other seamless comfort this house has offered her since the moment she first stepped down from that early train. Let the house rest now. Let all of it rest. Tom can sleep, his hands still faintly grey with ash even after washing, 3 hours left to him before the alarm inside his own body wakes him again for another fire, another cold grate, another long climb down worn stone stairs in the dark. Let the housemaids sleep, their shoulders finally still after a day spent almost entirely in motion, curtains and fires and hot water and turned-down beds, 100 small tasks each performed so quietly that not one of them left a single visible trace behind. Let the footmen sleep, their evening of careful, silent choreography behind them now, dinner served without a single dropped dish, without a single wrong wine poured to the wrong glass at the wrong moment. Let the valet sleep, his employer's evening clothes already brushed and hung for tomorrow, waiting. Let Sarah sleep, in the small room off Mrs. Aldworth's own, close enough to hear if she is needed in the night, far enough to have a version of privacy that this particular house in its own limited way tried to offer even its most junior staff. And let Mrs. Nettlefold sleep, an entire day's meals already planned for tomorrow before she even climbed the stairs tonight. A saddle of mutton and a sauce she wants to try, filed away in a mind that never really stops composing even in rest. Let Mrs. Ferris sleep in her own private room that represents, after nearly 4 decades in service, the closest thing to a home entirely her own that a life like hers was ever likely to produce. Let the butler sleep, his silver counted, his doors bolted, his lamp extinguished, the whole visible half of this magnificent house checked and secured one final time by a man who has come, over years, to feel something close to genuine ownership over its safety through the night hours, whatever the actual deed to the property might say. Mrs. Aldworth can sleep, her diamonds back in their case, her hair loosely plaited, a slim volume of poetry closed on the nightstand beside her. Let Lady Beauchamp sleep, in a room that did not exist in its current state until this same morning, entirely unaware of the quiet urgency that produced it, sleeping instead in the simple, seamless comfort the whole house conspired to make feel inevitable. Let the Earl sleep, tenant farms and boundary disputes set aside until tomorrow's more ordinary business hours. Let the Countess sleep, in the bedroom that has been hers for decades, home in every sense that guests 2 doors down could only borrow for a week. Let the children sleep, up under a different roofline than either their parents or the staff who cared for them today, having lived their own small, entirely separate version of this same long day. The house itself can rest too, if a building can be said to rest, this old golden stone that has stood through so many nights exactly like this one, so many days exactly like today, that it would be difficult to say with any real precision how many thousands of fires have been laid in its grates, how many thousands of trays of hot water carried up its narrow back stairs, how many thousands of dinners served across its long polished table by hands that have by now changed many times over across the generations, one set of servants replacing another the way seasons replace each other, the underlying work itself remaining almost entirely unchanged beneath all that quiet turnover. Its grand staircase stands entirely empty now, its long polished banister cool under nobody's resting hand, wide enough for a whole party of guests in evening silk to descend together, and yet holding, at this hour, nothing at all except darkness and the faint smell of old wood and older stone. The saloon stands empty, its portraits looking down on nothing. The library stands empty, its books settled and silent. The deep chair by the window waiting for a reader who will not return to it for several more hours yet. The dining room stands empty, its table cleared and reset for tomorrow's breakfast, silver polished, linen fresh, ready to receive a household that has not yet begun to stir, sits now in a stillness so complete it feels almost like its own separate kind of presence, the house holding its own particular silence the way it held, only hours ago, an entire evening's worth of laughter and conversation and the small clink of crystal against crystal. Outside, the Hampshire countryside lies dark and quiet under a sky beginning, almost imperceptibly, to hint at the first grey suggestion of a dawn still comfortably far away. The cedar trees stand exactly where they have stood for longer than anyone currently sleeping inside this house has been alive. The parkland stretches out into darkness in every direction, empty of horses and riders now, empty of the motor car that carried Lady Beauchamp up from the station this same morning, holding nothing but its own long undisturbed quiet until the grooms rise, in a few hours, to begin another day's care of the animals still resting in their stalls. Somewhere beyond the trees, the village itself sleeps too, its own smaller rhythms of work and rest running alongside the great house's much larger, more elaborate version of the very same thing. And Highclere Castle, from any distance at all, from the lawn where we began this whole long story so many hours ago, looks exactly as it looked before any of this began. Dark, still, silent, utterly, convincingly asleep. A person walking past now, at this hour, would see nothing to suggest that inside these walls, across the last 20 hours, an entire small society had woken, worked, dressed, dined, laughed, worried, solved a dozen small problems, absorbed a change of plans, produced an evening of genuine warmth and genuine hospitality, and finally, one by one, floor by floor, room by room, closed itself down again into exactly this same appearance of perfect, effortless, unbroken rest. That, in the end, is the whole quiet miracle of a house like this one. Not that it never worked. It worked constantly, every single hour, every single day, through hands that mostly went unnamed and effort that mostly went unacknowledged, but that all of that work, all of that skill, all of that careful invisible labour existed for exactly one purpose: to make an enormous, complicated, demanding household of 30 or more people wake and dress and eat and receive its guests and answer its bells and prepare its fires and serve its tea and dress again for dinner and turn down its beds and finally gently sleep, so that tomorrow, in a few short hours, before the sky has properly lightened over the cedar trees, the whole of it might simply begin again. Somewhere in the servants' hall, a single clock keeps its own steady watch over an entirely empty room, chairs pushed neatly back under the long table where the household ate its own dinner hours before the family sat down to theirs, the fire there reduced now to little more than a faint orange memory of itself among the ash. It is very nearly the last room in the whole house to fall properly silent tonight, the room where every single thread we have followed today, upstairs and downstairs, family and staff, grand rooms and hidden corridors, ultimately gathered and dispersed again, and now at last it holds nothing at all except its own quiet waiting, the way it waits every single night for tomorrow's first tired figure to push open its door again in the dark hours just before dawn. There is a particular hour, somewhere close to 5, when the very first genuine hint of morning begins to touch the eastern sky above the parkland. Not light exactly, not yet, but a faint lessening of the deepest part of the night's darkness, the kind of change so gradual that nobody watching for it could point to the exact moment it began. A blackbird somewhere near the walled garden is the first to notice, or at least the first to respond, a single uncertain phrase of song offered into the darkness, and then, after a pause, offered again, slightly more confidently this time. Inside the house, nothing stirs yet. The fires banked low in a dozen bedroom grates hold their quiet warmth. The clocks continue their steady ticking in room after empty room, in the hall, in the library, on Mrs. Aldworth's own mantel, each one a small mechanical heart keeping its own private rhythm inside a house otherwise given over entirely to stillness. Somewhere under the roofline, in a room barely large enough for 2 narrow beds, Tom sleeps on for perhaps another quarter of an hour, the ash still faintly grey under his fingernails, his whole small, tired body given over completely to the kind of deep, dreamless rest that only genuine physical exhaustion produces. In a little while, though not yet, not for a short while longer, this same boy will wake in the dark, dress quietly, and begin the long walk down 4 flights of worn stone stairs toward a kitchen range that has held its warmth through the whole of this quiet night, waiting only for a hand to build it back up into something that can once again hold an entire day. He will kneel before it exactly as he knelt before it yesterday morning and the day before that, and will kneel before it again tomorrow and the day after. The small, unglamorous beginning of a machine so large and so carefully coordinated that almost nobody sleeping above him tonight has ever properly understood its full shape at all. But that is still to come. For now, for this last quiet stretch of true night, the whole of it rests. The blackbird falls silent again. The sky above the cedar trees holds its faint, uncertain grey without yet committing to anything resembling true light. The house stands dark against it, golden stone gone almost black in this last hour before dawn. Every window closed, every fire low, every door shut, every person inside it, family and guest and servant alike, finally completely given over to sleep. Highclere Castle, from the lawn, from the road, from anywhere at all outside its own walls, looks exactly as it has always looked at this particular hour, exactly as it looked when this whole long story began. Perfectly still, perfectly silent, perfectly convincingly asleep. The same golden stone, the same dark windows, the same cedar trees standing quiet watch over a lawn now silvered with dew rather than rain, the same owl, or one very much like it, calling once more somewhere down past the parkland before falling silent for good until tomorrow night. And somewhere inside it, in rooms both grand and hidden, in beds both wide and narrow, an entire small world rests together in the dark, waiting, without knowing it is waiting, for the first fire of tomorrow to be lit quietly by hands that have already done this so many times before and will do it, without complaint and almost entirely without notice, so very many times again.